Hello, my name is Steve Kaufman. I've written a book titled The Nature of Reality, What We Really Are, and the Amazing Story of How We Got Here. And the purpose of both the book and this series of videos, of which this is the third, is to tell the story of how the reality that we really are got itself into the situation that we are in. Now, in this series of videos, I'm telling the same story that I already told in the book, and I'm repeating myself in this video format because I'm using whatever means I can to provide human beings with an understanding of the situation they are in so they can begin to free themselves from that situation because it's not a pleasant situation to be in. And the fastest and surest way out of the situation that we are in is to become aware of that situation because that situation can only perpetuate itself while we remain completely unaware of both the situation we are in and what we ourselves must be doing to place ourselves in that situation. Now, the first video I gave an overview of the situation we are in, and in the second video I began to tell the story of how the reality that we really are got itself into that situation. And as I stated in both the first and second videos, the situation we are in is that we are beginningless, endless, and formless awareness that has effectively trapped itself within mind-generated physical and mental experiential environments as a result of mistaking what are only mind-generated physical and mental appearances for being realities that are both actually there and what we really are. And our individual awarenesses have become effectively trapped within what are only mind-generated experiential environments because mistaking an appearance for a reality that's actually there produces a limiting condition that obscures from one's awareness the reality that is actually there, leaving one aware of only the appearance and unaware of the reality that is actually there. And the evidence that our awarenesses operate in that way lies in the fact that if you mistakenly believe what is only a reflection to be what's actually there, then for as long as you believe that, you remain unaware of the mirror that is actually there, even though you have to be looking right at the mirror in order to be aware of the reflection that you mistakenly believe to be the reality that's actually there. And because what we really are is the reality that is actually there, where physical and mental reality only appear to be, our mistakenly believing the physical and mental appearances that our minds are producing to be realities that are actually there has produced a limiting condition that has left us aware of only the experiential appearances and unaware of the reality that we really are, and so has left our individual awarenesses effectively trapped in realities that are composed solely of experiential appearances, and we suffer tremendously as a result. And so, what I'm doing by telling the story of how the formless reality that we really are causes all of this to happen is providing human beings with information that will make it possible for them to understand the projection and reflection like nature of physical and mental reality so they can stop mistakenly believing in those mind generated appearances as being realities that are actually there. So they can stop producing the limiting condition that is keeping the reality that is both actually there and what they really are obscured from their individual awarenesses. So they can more easily become directly aware of that reality and in so doing free their individual awarenesses from the mind generated experiential cages in which they do not even know they are effectively trapped because they so firmly and fully believe those experiential cages to be realities that are both actually there and what they really are. As I said in the first video, it would not be possible to come up with a science fiction or fantasy scenario that is more amazing and bizarre than the situation in which the reality that we really are has placed itself. And that situation is that we are a beginningless, endless, and ultimately formless reality that is flowing through and animating structured forms of ourself that have the ability to produce two related sets of appearances. And those two related sets of appearances are what we are aware of and refer to as physical and mental reality. And in the same way that we naturally and unavoidably mistake what is only a reflection for being what's actually there, when we don't know that we are looking at a mirror, we have naturally and unavoidably mistaken the mind generated physical and mental appearances for being realities that are actually there, because we don't know that what is actually there, and so what we are really looking at is just a relationally structured form of the same formless reality that is aware of those appearances. And that natural and unavoidable mistake has obscured from our individual awarenesses the reality that is actually there, and so has obscured from our individual awarenesses the reality that we really are. Because what we really are is the ultimately formless reality that is actually there, where mind generated physical and mental reality only appear to be. And once we have obscured from our awareness the reality that is both actually there and what we really are, the only realities that we remain aware of are the three created experiential appearances that we refer to as physical, mental, and emotional reality. And from then on, those three created experiential appearances appear to be what is real and all that is real, causing them to function as the walls of a cage in which our individual awarenesses inadvertently trap themselves as a result of doing nothing more than becoming and remaining mistakenly aware of those created experiential appearances as being realities that are actually there, where they really only appear to be. And while effectively trapped in those experiential cages, we suffer, because while effectively trapped in those experiential cages, we operate in the world according to what are ultimately completely delusional ideas regarding what both we and the world actually are. And as a result, we tend to direct our individualized flow of awareness in opposition to the non individualized flow of awareness that is actually there where the physical universe appears to be. And that self-oppositional relation of awareness to itself produces what we become individually aware of as a negative or unwanted emotional experience. And those negative and unwanted emotional experiences are the essence of what we refer to as psychological suffering. And we spend our lives trying to escape the psychological suffering that being trapped in an experiential cage unavoidably causes us to produce and become aware of, never knowing that the only way to truly put an end to that suffering, as opposed to just tamping it down or covering it up for a bit, is to free our individual awareness from the mind-generated experiential cage in which we do not even know that we have inadvertently trapped ourselves. And the only way to free your individual awareness from the mind-generated experiential cage in which you are, in all likelihood, presently effectively trapping yourself, is to become directly aware of the formless reality that's both actually there and what you really are, and which reality is being presently obscured by, and so remains hidden behind, the veil of mind-generated physical and mental appearances that you mistakenly believe to be realities that are actually there, where only your own formless reality actually is, albeit in a relationally structured form. And it is simply the case that it is much easier to become directly aware of that formless reality once you understand the nature of reality and how you got here, and so understand the situation you're in. So then you are at least aware that there is a reality that lies beyond the experiential appearances that you can become directly aware of, should you choose to do so. How can you possibly operate in the world in a truly functional way when the reality that is both actually there and what you really are is being continuously obscured from your awareness? The answer is you can't. It's just not possible any more than you could functionally drive a car while blindfolded. But our situation is even crazier than trying to drive a car while blindfolded, because in our situation, we're driving while blindfolded while also mistakenly believing that we have a clear view of what's out there and what's going on. So we just keep going, running into things and feeling bad, and then wondering why life has to be so fucking painful and so full of assholes. But they're not really assholes, they're just functioning as assholes because they've gotten all turned around and twisted up while trying to escape the suffering that comes with being trapped in an experiential cage. They're the same reality you are, and the same reality everything else is as well. And the degree of assholishness they exhibit is simply a function of how deeply they are trapped within their mind generated reality. And so is a function of how much they are suffering and how little awareness they have left of their own nature and of their ultimate connection and oneness with all it is, regardless of any appearance to the contrary. In any case, life is painful and full of suffering because we are driving blindfolded, completely unaware of what we really are and of the situation we're in. What I'm trying to do is help you remove that blindfold so you can operate and drive the body and mind you are flowing through and animating in a more functional way, and so in a way that produces less suffering. And please understand that when I say that you, as a present day human being, are most likely effectively trapped in a mind generated experiential delusion, that I'm not trying to insult you, because there is nothing personal in that statement. because I am not addressing or speaking to the person that you mistakenly believe yourself to be. Because the person that you mistakenly believe yourself to be is just some relatively random set of mind generated physical and mental appearances that the formless, timeless, and infinite awareness that you really are has misidentified with as a result of obscuring from your awareness the reality that you really are, leaving you with no choice but to misidentify with the only realities that you are left aware of once you have done that. And so when I speak to you in these videos, I am not speaking to the person that you, in all likelihood, are mistakenly aware of yourself as being. Instead, I am speaking to the formless, timeless, and deathless reality that you really are, beyond the mind-generated physical and mental appearances that you mistakenly believe to be both what is actually there and what you really are. And so I'm not trying to insult you or put you down by saying that you are, in all likelihood, effectively trapping yourself in a mind generated experiential delusion as a result of mistakenly believing that what are only mind generated physical and mental appearances are realities that are actually there. Because ultimately, what I'm saying is that what you really are is the formless and fundamental reality out of which the entire universe is constructed and of which it is composed, beyond the mind generated physical surface appearance that you, in all likelihood, mistakenly believe to be the reality that's actually there, where a relationally structured form of the formless reality that you really are actually is. And so, what I'm trying to do is wake you up to your true and infinitely badass nature by explaining in detail how the reality that you really are managed to place itself in this amazing, bizarre, and yet unquestionably fucked up situation where an uncreated reality that cannot cease to be and cannot be harmed in any way has come to believe itself to be a reality that is born and dies and can, in the interim, be harmed in countless ways. And the way that the formless reality that you really are placed itself in this situation is by structurally evolving and then flowing through and animating a structured form of itself that, as a result of that animating flow, is able to produce the three experiential appearances that you are aware of as physical, mental, and emotional reality. And ultimately, relative to your true formless and fundamental reality, those three experiential appearances are no more real than the appearances and apparent realities that are able to be produced by a virtual reality or VR headset. However, the relationally structured forms of ourself that we are flowing through and animating evolved to produce those three experiential appearances in order to provide our individual awarenesses with information that we can use to navigate and structurally survive in the relationally structured environment composed of ourself in which we must operate while animating what appears to be a physical body, but which physical body is, once again, actually just a relationally structured form of our own formless, timeless, and deathless reality. And what we have done as individual awarenesses that are flowing through and animating what are ultimately structured forms of our own formless reality is mistake the useful and necessary information that is being produced by these structured forms of ourself for being realities that are actually there. And that simple and unavoidable mistake is causing those experiential appearances to function like misperceived reflections, and so as delusions that are obscuring and so keeping hidden from our individual awarenesses the ultimately formless reality that is actually there, where those experiential realities as created appearances only appear to be. And because the ultimately formless reality that is actually there, where the created experiential realities only appear to be, is the reality that we really are, the obscuring of the reality that is actually there from our individual awarenesses is identical to the obscuring of the reality that we really are from our individual awarenesses, leaving us aware of only the experiential appearances and not at all aware of the reality that we really are, which then leaves our individual awarenesses effectively trapped in an experiential cage that we ourselves are helping to construct and maintain by doing nothing more than continuing to mistakenly believe that the experiential realities are realities that are both actually there and what we really are. And because continuing to make that simple and, at least initially, unavoidable mistake is keeping your individual awareness effectively trapped in an experiential cage where you then suffer, what I am trying to do is coax you out of that cage by explaining exactly how the formless reality that you really are structurally evolved to the point where it became both necessary and possible for that reality to evolve a mind structure that is capable of creating the two related sets of experiential appearances that we refer to as physical and mental reality, so that you can stop mistakenly believing in those created appearances in a way that continuously converts them into self-obscuring delusions. There's simply no reason at this point in time for human beings to keep running around while mistakenly believing that the two virtual realities being produced by our minds, i.e., physical and mental reality, are realities that are both actually there and what we really are, other than force of habit. That mistaken belief no longer serves any useful function and is only producing increasing dysfunction as it continues to keep hidden from both our collective awareness and our individual awarenesses the formless reality that is both actually there and what we really are, and so continues to keep hidden from our collective awareness and our individual awarenesses the fact that what both we and the universe really are is a single, indivisible, uncreated, and formless reality that is structurally evolving while becoming increasingly aware of itself. And as I explained in the second video, the formless and fundamental reality that you really are structurally evolves through a process of iterative and progressive self-relation. And in that second video, I described in some detail how that formless and fundamental reality evolves into the first two levels of relational structure. And I also explained that those first two levels of relational structure are the underlying basis of the physical appearances that we refer to as empty physical space and light. And in this third video, I'm going to continue with a detailed description of how the formless and fundamental reality that we really are structurally evolves by describing how that reality structurally evolves into the third level relational structures that are actually there where inanimate matter appears to be. And then in the next or fourth video, I will describe the relation that the fundamental reality forms with itself in order to exist and function as a fourth level of relational structure, and which fourth level relational structures are what is actually there where animated or living matter appears to be. And having explained all of that, I will then, in the fifth video, describe the nature and evolution of the specialized fourth level relational structure that we refer to as the mind, including how that specialized structure makes it possible for a relationally structured reality to form the transient structural relations with itself that produce the externally projected and internally reflected experiential appearances that we, as individual awarenesses that are flowing through and animating those minds, become aware of as physical and mental reality. And then in the sixth video, I will present evidence that the description of physical reality as a created and non-objective appearance is accurate by fully accounting for the appearance of both macroscopic and quantum physical reality, by showing how those differently appearing physical realities are both created by the same type of transient structural relation, as that relation takes place under two different sets of mutually exclusive structural conditions, thereby producing two different and mutually exclusive sets of physical appearances, one of which appears deterministic and the other of which appears probabilistic, but neither of which is the non-physical, non-experiential, relationally structured reality that is actually there, where either only appears to be. And so, as I said in the second video, and will now say again in this video, and will probably say in every video, these are not standalone videos because the concepts presented in the preceding videos provide the context for the concepts that are presented in the current video. What that means is that if you have not watched the preceding videos, there is virtually no chance whatsoever that you will be able to understand the concepts that I'm going to present in this video. And that's because, as I said in the first two videos, and will probably say in every video, although language is an amazing thing that allows a concept that exists in one mind to be transferred to another mind, in order for that conceptual transfer to successfully take place, two conditions must be met. And one of those conditions is that both minds have to speak the same language. And the other condition is that the mind that is on the receiving end of the conceptual transmission has to already possess a compatible conceptual context into which the concept that is being transmitted can be integrated. And the fact is, given the current state of most human awarenesses, which is the state of being effectively trapped in a mind-generated experiential delusion, completely unaware of the reality they really are and of the situation they are in, if you have not watched the two preceding videos, then it is almost certainly the case that you are not in possession of a compatible conceptual context that will allow you to understand the concepts that I'm going to present in this video. And that's because the concepts that I have already presented and am going to continue to present are completely contrary to the concepts that make up the experiential delusion in which you are, in all likelihood, effectively trapped, and so from within which you are, in all likelihood, presently operating. Because for a concept to be truly understood by your awareness, you have to be able to do more than just understand the words that are being used to transmit that concept. The words are just the means by which a mental picture is being painted, and a compatible conceptual context is the canvas upon which that picture can be painted using words. But if no compatible conceptual context exists in your mind, then no accurate picture can be painted, no matter how many words are used and no matter how well you understand the individual words, leaving you either with no understanding of the concept that was being transmitted, or even worse, leaving you with a distorted and delusional understanding of the concept that was being transmitted because you forced that concept into an incompatible conceptual context. And that's why these videos are so long, not because there's all that much to explain or because what's actually going on is all that complicated, because there's not much to explain, because what's actually going on is not at all complicated. There's actually very little happening, and what's happening is actually pretty simple. Most of the jabbering that I do in these videos is done to establish the conceptual context in your mind that will allow you to understand the simplicity of what's actually happening beyond the seeming complexity of the physical and mental surface appearances. Because I'm not talking to individual awarenesses who have no knowledge of anything, but am instead talking to individual awarenesses who have a completely inverted view of the nature of reality, and so are operating from within a conceptual context that is the complete opposite of the conceptual context that one needs to be operating from within in order to truly understand the nature of reality and the situation that your awareness is in. And so I can't just explain what's going on and leave it at that, because that would be a waste of my time and yours, because you would either not understand the concepts I'm trying to convey, or even worse, you would twist and distort those concepts in order to make them fit into your delusional conception of reality, after which you would then mistakenly believe that you had acquired some deeper understanding of the nature of reality, when all you would have really done is become more deeply lost in a mind-generated delusion that bears no relation whatsoever to the actual nature of reality. As I explained in the book and in the first video, that's how religions are created, and that's also how the probabilistic interpretation of quantum physical reality was created. And so to prevent that from happening, which is to say, to prevent this relatively accurate description of reality from either being not understood or being distorted and assimilated into the delusion, where it will then function not to free you from the experiential delusion, but will just keep you even more firmly trapped in that delusion, I can't just explain what's going on, because I have to simultaneously build a conceptual structure that is completely contrary to the conceptual structure from within which you are presently operating, so that you can, while operating from within that new conceptual structure, truly understand the relatively simple concepts regarding the nature of reality that I am, using language, attempting to transfer from my mind to yours. By way of analogy, I can't just prepare a feast of concepts and then come serve them to you where you presently live, because if I do that, it will either have no nutritional value or, even worse, will poison you and make you even sicker than you already are. Instead, what I have to do is not just prepare a feast of concepts, but I also have to simultaneously build an entirely new conceptual structure for you to enter into, where you can then consume those concepts so that you can understand them in a way that will help free you from the experiential cage and not just trap you even deeper within it. In any case, I'm now going to continue where I left off in the last video with the telling of the story of what we really are and how we got here, after a very brief recap of the essential concepts presented in that video. The reality of which the entire universe is composed and constructed beyond the physical surface appearance is the same formless reality that is aware of what I am saying right now. And that formless reality, or formless awareness, has structurally evolved through a process of iterative and progressive self-relation as a result of its speed of light movement in relation to itself. Specifically, that formless reality has structurally evolved into four progressive levels of relational structure as a result of its speed of light movement in relation to itself. And those four progressive levels of relational structure are the underlying and actual basis of the mind-generated etchings that we perceive as the physical realities of space, light, inanimate matter, and animated or living matter. And in the last video, I explained in some detail how formless awareness, by moving in relation to itself at the speed of light, structurally evolves into the first two levels of relational structure. And I also related those two levels of relational structure to the physical characteristics of the physical reality that we refer to as light or electromagnetic radiation, showing how the physical characteristics of light exist as a function of and as a sort of etching of the relationally structured awareness that is actually there where light, as a mind-generated physical reality, only appears to be. And in this video, I'm going to do the same thing with respect to the third level of relational awareness structure. That is, I'm going to explain in some detail how formless awareness structurally evolves into a third level of relational structure once it is functioning as the first two levels of relational structure. And once I've described and explained the anatomy and functioning of the third level relational awareness structures that are actually there where we perceive inanimate matter to be, I will then use that description to relate the third level of relational structure to the physical characteristics of inanimate matter, showing how the physical characteristics of matter exist as a function of and as a sort of etching of the relationally structured awareness that is actually there where matter, as a mind-generated physical reality, only appears to be. Specifically, what I will do once I have described the anatomy and functioning of third level relational structures is describe exactly what time and mass both are, as well as why those two physical characteristics of matter must vary in the way that Einstein, in one of his relativity theories, predicted they would vary as a result of variations in material speed relative to the speed of light. And what I will also do, once I've described the anatomy and functioning of third level relational structures, is describe exactly what gravity is and how it functions. But before we can get to the fun part of putting this puzzle of reality together, we first have to undertake the part that is not quite so much fun. And that part is analogous to turning over the pieces of a puzzle so we can see what's there. And so let's start turning those pieces over by describing how third level relational structures come to exist within the first level of relational structure as a function of a relatively stable relation that second level relational structures are able to form with each other. And the relatively stable relation that second level relational structures are able to form with each other that allows them to function as part of a third level relational structure is a relatively simple relation that involves the linearly propagating maximal distortion components of two or more second level relational structures repetitively spiraling about each other at the speed of light, according to the cellular geometry that is allowed by the first level of relational structure. And what that spiral pattern of interaction looks like when represented in three dimensions is this. Now, in the video on the left is a Sculpey model that I made around 25 years ago to verify that the cubic close-packing cellular geometry of the first level of relational structure would allow for a spiral pattern of interaction to take place between two repetitively interacting maximal distortion components. And in that model and in the drawing on the right, the two maximal distortion components that are repetitively and so periodically interacting as a third level relational structure are colored yellow and red. And both the model and the drawing represent a sort of time-lapse image of those maximal distortion components in order to allow for a visualization of their path of propagation as they repetitively spiral about and so orbit each other, and in so doing function as a third level relational structure. Because in reality, each maximal distortion component only exists in one reality cell in any given moment. But as I will explain, third level relational structures do not exist in a moment, but only exist as a function of the geometric structure that is formed by the periodic pattern of interaction of its repetitively interacting maximal distortion components, as those components propagate non-linearly from reality cell to reality cell at the speed of light. And so, in order to describe and understand the anatomy of third level relational structures so that we can see what the physical realities of both mass and time are derived from at the level of relational structure, we need to be able to visualize that periodic pattern of interaction, which, as you can see, requires that the maximal distortion components propagate through far more than just one reality cell, and so requires a sequence of many moments. In any case, when that spiral pattern of maximal distortion component interaction is translated into two dimensions, what it looks like is this. Now in the drawing on the left, the two repetitively interacting maximal distortion components are depicted in two different shades of gray, while the less than maximal distortion components that exist in concert with those two repetitively interacting maximal distortion components are not depicted at all. So that we can focus at this point on the aspect of third level relational structures that involves the periodically repeating geometric pattern and structure that is produced by its repetitively interacting maximal distortion components, as those repetitively interacting maximal distortion components exist not in a single moment, but throughout a sequence of moments. And so, once again, the image on the left represents a sort of time-lapse drawing that displays the path of propagation of the maximal distortion components as they exist, not over some period of time, but as they exist as the result of a specific amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, because it is that speed of light movement, as it functions as the first level of relational structure, that drives all movement of all distorted reality cell content through the first level of relational structure. Because chronological time, as I'll explain in a bit, is nothing more than a physical appearance or etching that is able to be produced as a result of second level relational structures repetitively and so periodically interacting as third level relational structures. Put another way, what I'm eventually going to explain is that it is a fixed and yet ultimately variable periodicity that is intrinsic to the anatomy of third level relational structures that most directly functions as the fixed and yet ultimately variable physical characteristic of matter that we perceive and conceive as chronological time. And what I'm also going to explain is that the fixed and yet ultimately variable periodicity of third level relational structures only exists as a function of some fixed but ultimately variable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. But to get to the point where I can explain all that, I first need to explain why second level relational structures are able to form the stable relations with each other that cause them to function as a third level of relational structure. And so that's what I'll do next. Now, as already mentioned, all that is shown in these drawings are the two maximal distortion components of two second level relational structures as they continuously orbit each other and so repetitively spiral around each other at the speed of light, and in so doing function as a third level relational structure, which is to say as a third way the fundamental reality has become stably structured as a result of its speed of light movement in relation to itself. However, as you no doubt remember from watching the second video, second level relational structures are composed of two different and yet related distortion components, each of which continuously helps to reproduce the other. Specifically, the maximal distortion component radiates around itself a radially propagating and exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion component, while that less than maximal distortion component helps to reproduce in the next reality cell in linear progression the maximal distortion component, and on it goes, like a very fast moving game of leapfrog. And this drawing shows what happens to those less than maximal distortion components when second level relational structures function as part of a third level relational structure. Now in this drawing, which on the left shows two second level relational structures and on the right shows the same two second level structures becoming involved in the repetitive and periodic type of relation with each other that constitutes a third level relational structure, the maximal distortion components are depicted in black and the less than maximal distortion components are represented by incrementally lighter shades of gray. And what this drawing shows on its right side is that when second level relational structures function as part of a third level relational structure, their less than maximal distortion components summate and become spherically, or more accurately, elliptically distributed around the repetitively interacting maximal distortion components. And later we will get into exactly why those less than maximal distortion components come to be elliptically distributed around the repetitively interacting maximal distortion components, and in so doing, function as the underlying basis of the physical reality that we perceive and conceive as a gravitational field. But right now the focus is upon both why and how second level relational structures are able to repetitively interact in this way, and in so doing function as the third level relational structures that are actually there where we perceive any bit of matter to be. And the reason second level relational structures are able to repetitively interact in this way is as a function of the effect that an asymmetrically distributed less than maximal distortion field is able to have upon which adjacent reality cell a maximal distortion propagates into next. As already mentioned, any maximal distortion radiates around itself a radially propagating and exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion, and that less than maximal distortion then helps to reproduce in the next reality cell in linear progression the maximal distortion. And together, those two components propagate through the first level of relational awareness structure as a second level relational awareness structure. However, and this is new information, the less than maximal distortion component only functions to help reproduce the maximal distortion component in the next reality cell in linear progression if that less than maximal distortion is symmetrically distributed around the maximal distortion, so that it is the next reality cell in linear progression that first becomes maximally distorted, as distorted reality cell content is exchanged with all adjacent reality cells as a function of the dynamic that is intrinsic to the first level of relational structure. On the other hand, if the less than maximal distortion is not symmetrically distributed around the maximal distortion, but is instead asymmetrically distributed so that there is greater or more distorted less than maximal distortion content on one side of the maximal distortion, then the maximal distortion is not reproduced and so is not propagated into the next reality cell in linear progression, but is instead reproduced and propagated into an adjacent reality cell that lies in the direction in which the less than maximal distortion is greater or more distorted. And so the nonlinear progression and so nonlinear propagation of a maximal distortion component occurs as the result of an asymmetric less than maximal distortion field existing around that maximal distortion, because it is the next adjacent reality cell that first reaches the level of maximal distortion that becomes the set point from which that second level relational structure then continues to propagate through the first level of relational structure as a second level relational structure. And so what this drawing shows in a clockwise progression are the propagational paths of the maximal distortion components of two second-level relational structures, each being altered by the asymmetrically distributed less than maximal distortion field each encounters as they pass by each other, with the propagational path of each maximal distortion component being altered in the direction of the greater less than maximal distortion field that comes to exist between those two maximal distortion components as the less than maximal distortion component associated with each combines and so summates in the space between them. You see, relational structures do not stop functioning as their particular level of relational structure just because they become involved in a relation that causes them to also function as a higher order level of relational structure. The first level of relational structure continues to function as it functions once second level relational structures emerge and exist within it. And second level relational structures continue to function as second level relational structures once they form stable relations with each other and, in so doing, function as a third level of relational structure. It's just that once a level of relational structure forms a stable relation with itself, and so then functions as a higher order level of relational structure, new properties emerge along with that new level of relational structure. However, those new properties always have as their basis properties that already exist at the preceding levels of relational structure, because those new properties just represent a new way those already existing properties are interacting to produce the new property. And you will see that happen once I get around to explaining exactly what time, mass, and gravity are, because all three of those physical characteristics are the physical etchings of non-physical relationally structured properties that emerge along with the emergence of the third level of relational structure. as the result of new ways that properties that already exist at the first and second levels of relational structure interact and exist while functioning as a third level of relational structure. In any case, it is simply the case that since distorted reality cell content is able to summate up to but not beyond the point of maximal distortion, if a maximal distortion encounters an asymmetrically distributed less than maximal distortion field, then an adjacent reality cell that lies in the direction of greater less than maximal distortion will be the first reality cell to have the distorted content that is entering and summating in that reality cell reach the maximally distorted level. And it is then that non-linearly adjacent reality cell that then becomes the set point from which that second level relational structure then continues to propagate through the first level of relational structure as a second level relational structure, regardless of whether or not that second level structure is or is not taking part in a relation with other second level structures to produce a third level relational structure. In summary, then, the otherwise linearly propagating maximal distortion component of a second level relational structure is able to have its direction of propagation altered as the result of encountering an asymmetrically distributed less than maximal distortion field. And so the next question that we have to ask and answer in order to understand how and why second level relational structures are able to repetitively interact in a way that causes them to function as third level relational structures is how does the maximal distortion component of a second level relational structure encounter an asymmetrically distributed less than maximal distortion field? And the answer is by coming in close proximity to another second level relational structure, so that the less than maximal distortion component that each possesses then summates in the space between them, thereby creating an asymmetrically distributed less than maximal distortion field with respect to each maximal distortion component, thereby simultaneously altering the direction of each maximal distortion component in a way that causes both second level relational structures to then and thereafter continuously alter the direction of propagation of the other second level relational structure in a way that leaves each spiraling about or orbiting the other. Because in the final analysis, and as you will see clearly once all of this has been explained, the exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion that radially propagates away from the maximal distortion is simply a very, very tiny, very fundamental, and very basic gravitational field. But I don't want to get into the details of that yet because we have not yet established the conceptual context that will allow that simple fact to become completely clear. And the conceptual context that will allow that simple fact to become completely clear is a description of the anatomy and functioning of third level relational structures, as those structures must exist and operate within the first level of relational structure. And the way that the anatomy and functioning of third level relational structures is going to be described is by explaining how the periodic geometry of those structures must change in order for them to propagate either faster or slower through the cellular geometry of the first level of relational structure. And understanding how the periodic geometry of third level relational structures must change in order for their propagational speed to change will make it possible for us to see exactly what both chronological time and mass are etchings of, and so what they actually are at the level of relational structure. And once you see what the physical characteristics referred to as time and mass are actually derived from at the level of relational structure, the underlying reason for Einstein's relativity of time and mass will become relatively obvious. In any case, in order to explain how the periodic geometry of third level relational awareness structures must change in order for those structures to propagate either faster or slower through the cellular geometry of the first level of relational structure, I'm going to use a simple sort of time-lapse drawing that only depicts the maximal distortion components of two second-level relational structures, as those maximal distortion components repetitively and so periodically spiral around each other and so function together as a third-level relational structure. Now what this drawing shows is 5 different versions of the same third-level relational structure propagating from left to right through the first level of relational structure. And each different version of this third level relational structure is depicted as propagating at a different speed, and specifically is depicted as propagating at increasingly greater speeds from top to bottom. More specifically, going from top to bottom, this third level structure is depicted as propagating through the first level of relational structure at 50, 60, 67, 70, and 77% of the speed of light. And as the drawing shows, and as I will explain in detail, that same third level relational structure propagates at all of those different speeds as a function of the different periodic geometries that it must possess in order to propagate through the first level of relational structure at those different speeds. And we can know that this same and yet differently propagating third level relational structure is propagating at the different speeds I have stated relative to the speed of light, because depicted at the top and bottom of this drawing are maximal distortion components of the same reality cell size that are depicted as propagating through the first level of relational structure with complete linearity, which means they must be propagating linearly at the speed of light. And so the distance those linearly propagating maximal distortions travel in a given number of periods of content exchange can be compared to the linear distance the non-linearly propagating maximal distortions of the same size travel in the same number of periods of content exchange, thereby providing us with the linear speed at which the 5 same and yet differently propagating third level relational structures depicted in this drawing are propagating as a percentage of the speed of light. Put another way, all we have to do to figure out how fast any of these same and yet differently propagating third level relational structures depicted are propagating through the first level of relational structure as a percentage of light speed is compare how far the maximal distortion propagates when it is propagating with complete linearity, which will be measured as the speed of light, and how far that same maximal distortion propagates in the same number of periods of content exchange when it is propagating non-linearly as a result of its functioning as part of a third level relational structure. And in order to make that calculation possible, I have used 3 different colors to indicate where the reality cell that contains the maximal distortion would be after 10, 20, and 30 periods of content exchange, both when it is propagating with complete linearity and when it is propagating with some variable degree of nonlinearity while functioning as part of a third level relational structure. And so what this drawing shows is that in order for a third level relational structure to propagate at a faster or slower speed through the first level of relational structure, the periodic geometry of that third level structure has to change in a very specific way. And the very specific way that its periodic geometry has to change is that the maximal distortion components that are repetitively and so periodically interacting as that third level relational structure have to propagate through the first level of relational structure with either an increasing or decreasing degree of propagational linearity. And what I mean by an increasing or decreasing degree of propagational linearity is highlighted on the right side of this drawing, which depicts an increase in propagational linearity from top to bottom, and so conversely depicts a decrease in propagational linearity from bottom to top. And so as you can see from this drawing, what I mean by degree of propagational linearity refers to how many times a maximal distortion component is able to linearly propagate in complete alignment with the direction that the third level structure as a whole is propagating before it changes direction, so that it is then propagating in a direction that is no longer in complete alignment with the direction that the third level structure as a whole is propagating. And the reason the propagational linearity of the maximal distortion components must change in order for a third level structure to propagate either faster or slower through the first level of relational structure is because you can't make a maximal distortion propagate through the first level of relational structure at anything more or less than the speed of light, because that's the only speed at which reality cell content is being exchanged between adjacent reality cells. And so, when a maximal distortion is propagating nonlinearly as a result of being part of a third level relational structure, then the only way for it to linearly propagate through the first level of relational structure at a faster or slower speed is for it to propagate with increasing or decreasing amounts of propagational linearity, while it continues to nonlinearly propagate as part of that third level relational structure. Because those changes in maximal distortion component propagational linearity are the only way a third level relational structure can retain the same interactive structure while its periodic geometry undergoes the changes that must take place in order for that third level structure as a whole to propagate faster or slower through the first level of relational structure. And as this drawing shows, from top to bottom, increasing the degree of propagational linearity of the maximal distortion components increases the speed at which a third level relational structure propagates through the first level of relational structure. And so conversely, as this drawing also shows, from bottom to top, decreasing the degree of propagational linearity of the maximal distortion components decreases the speed at which a third level relational structure propagates through the first level of relational structure. And so the reason all physical movement is linked to the speed of light constant is simply because what's actually there, where any physical object appears to be, is a set of realities that are always propagating at the speed of light, albeit with some fixed and yet ultimately variable degree of nonlinearity, thereby causing that set of realities to linearly propagate as a third level relational structure at a speed that is always less than the speed of light. And as will be described, it is the changes in the degree of maximal distortion component propagational linearity that must take place for a third level relational structure to propagate either faster or slower through the first level of relational structure that are responsible for what we are able to perceive and conceive as the changes in both time and mass that occur when the speed of a material object changes, and which changes in time and mass occur as a function of material speed relative to the speed of light. However, in order to directly connect changes in the degree of propagational linearity to time and mass relativity, I regret to inform you that we still need to turn over one more piece of the puzzle in order to establish the context that will make that direct connection possible. And the piece of the puzzle that we still need to turn over is the piece where I describe in some detail one of the most abstract and yet important things there is to understand about third level relational structures, if you are to understand what mass and time really are at the level of relational structure. And that abstract and important thing is that third level relational structures do not exist as third level relational structures in an instant or in any given moment, but only exist as third level relational structures as a function of some fixed and yet ultimately variable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. And as will eventually be fully described, that fixed and yet ultimately variable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality does not occur over some period of time. Instead, that timeless movement produces a fixed and yet ultimately variable periodic activity in third level relational structures that is the underlying basis of the physical surface appearance or etching that human beings eventually come to perceive and conceive as chronological time. And here I need to point out that chronological time must be distinguished from the purely psychological time that we refer to as past and future. Because while what we perceive and conceive as chronological time has as its basis something that is actually taking place at the level of relational structure, and so has as its basis something that is actually taking place at the level of what is actually there, where physical reality only appears to be, what we conceive as past and future are, on the other hand, pure mind creations that have no relation to or correlation with any actually existent reality, because the fundamental reality and all the relational structures it has become only ever are now. And in video 7, I will present a detailed description of mind-generated conceptual reality, and in that video I will explain why our minds evolved the ability to produce the purely conceptual realities of past and future. And in that video I will also explain how human awarenesses become effectively trapped in those purely mind-generated conceptual realities. But right now I am in the middle of establishing the context that will make it possible for that description to be understood. Specifically, I am in the middle of describing how the fundamental and formless reality that you really are structurally evolves. And more specifically, I am in the middle of describing how the fundamental and formless reality that you really are structurally evolves into the third level relational structures that are actually there where we perceive any bit of matter to be. And we have reached the point in that description where I need to explain that third level relational structures do not exist in an instant or in a given moment, but instead exist not over some period of time, but as a function of a specific and yet ultimately variable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. Now, of all the abstract stuff that I have to throw at you in order to describe in a meaningful way the structural evolution of the fundamental and formless reality, which means in a way that allows what I am describing as relationally structured reality to be related to physically perceived reality. This is possibly the most abstract of all that abstract stuff. But since I'm here to make the abstract less abstract by making it more concrete, that's what I'm going to do now, by explaining step by step how the formless and timeless speed of light movement of the fundamental reality functions as a third level of relational structure, not in an instant or in a given moment, but as a function of a specific and yet ultimately variable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, and which speed of light movement does not take place in time, but which speed of light movement does, while functioning as a third level of relational structure, produce the fixed and yet ultimately variable periodic activity that is the underlying basis of the mind-generated surface appearance that we refer to as chronological time. Now, third-level relational structures do not exist as third-level relational structures in an instant or in a given moment because, as already described, what third-level relational structures really are second-level relational structures that have become involved in a repetitive and so periodic structural relation. Now, what that means is that in order for a third-level relational structure to exist as a repetitive and so periodic pattern of interaction that is taking place between two or more second-level relational structures, the second-level relational structures of which any third-level relational structure is composed have to undergo more than one period of content exchange in order for their maximal distortion components to propagate from reality cell to reality cell in the repetitive and so periodic pattern of interaction that causes those second-level relational structures to function as a third-level relational structure. What that means is that in order to discuss the structural anatomy of a third-level relational structure, you can't just discuss where its maximal distortion components are in a given instant or now, which is in just one reality cell each, but you instead have to discuss where its maximal distortion components were over one full structural period, which is in many reality cells each, as those maximal distortion components spiraled about and orbited each other for one full cycle of structural interaction or one full cycle of third-level structural periodicity. And so what we have to do now is define what constitutes one full structural period for any third-level relational structure, because that definition will allow us to analyze and understand the geometric anatomy and functioning of third-level relational structures in a way that will make it possible to understand exactly what time and mass are both derived from at the level of relational structure, as well as why those physical characteristics must vary in the way they are known to vary as a function of material speed relative to the speed of light. And what constitutes one full structural period for any third-level relational structure is the geometric structure produced by its maximal distortion components, as those maximal distortion components exist through one full cycle or period of interaction. In order to clarify what is meant by that definition, we will use this drawing, which again depicts 5 different versions of the same third-level relational structure propagating through the first level of relational structure at 5 different speeds. And in this drawing, where each black sphere is located marks the end of one third-level structural period and the beginning of another third-level structural period. And so from this drawing, what can be seen is that one third-level structural period is composed of one full rotation of each maximal distortion component around the other. So they end up back where they started with respect to each other as they spiral around or orbit each other. And so one third-level structural period is what constitutes a third-level relational structure, because a third-level relational structure consists not of where its maximal distortion components are in a given instant, which is in just one reality cell each, but instead it consists of the geometric structure that is traced and produced by those maximal distortion components as they exist over one full third-level structural period. And again, that's because what any third-level relational structure is a relatively stable, repetitive, and so periodic interaction that is taking place between two or more second-level relational structures. And that periodic interaction produces a specific cellular structural geometry with respect to the maximal distortion components of those repetitively and so periodically interacting second-level relational structures. And this drawing shows the most fundamental third-level relational structure possible because it shows a third level structure that is composed of just two repetitively and so periodically interacting second level relational structures. However, whatever we discuss with regard to the anatomy and functioning of this most basic and fundamental of third level relational structures applies to all third level relational structures, regardless of how many second level relational structures are repetitively and so periodically interacting to produce those third level structures. And that's because all third level relational structures have the same basic interactive and spiral structural anatomy, regardless of how many second level relational structures are repetitively and so periodically interacting to produce those third level structures, thanks to the infinitely recursive structure of the first level of relational structure, which allows a given third level structure to become involved in a spiral, repetitive, and so periodic relation with another third level structure. And again, that's a lot of words to describe something that's relatively simple. So here's a drawing that shows how simple it is. Now what's depicted in this drawing are the spirally and repetitively interacting maximal distortion components of two third-level relational structures, labeled A and B, that are themselves repetitively interacting with each other in the same spiral pattern of interaction that itself produces each of those third-level structures, thereby producing a higher order or more compounded third-level relational structure composed of four rather than just two repetitively interacting second-level relational structures. In order to allow for better visualization of such a higher order spiral pattern of interaction, in this drawing the upstroke of each third level structure is depicted using parallel lines. In any case, this more highly compounded third level relational structure can then form the same type of relation with another third level relational structure to produce an even higher order third level relational structure, which can then form the same type of relation with another third level relational structure, and so on ad infinitum, or almost ad infinitum. And the result is the increasingly compounded third level relational structures that are the underlying basis of what we physically perceive as the different atoms that are represented in the periodic table of elements. And so, because all third level relational structures have the same basic spiral structural anatomy, anything that we discuss with regard to the anatomy and functioning of the basic and fundamental third level relational structure depicted in this drawing applies to any third level relational structure, regardless of how many second level relational structures are repetitively and so periodically interacting to produce that third level structure. And so let's begin to dissect and analyze the anatomy of this most basic of third level relational structures in order to understand the changes that must take place in its geometric structure in order for it to propagate either faster or slower through the first level of relational structure. Because understanding what those structural changes are will reveal to us the underlying basis of the physical surface appearances that we refer to as chronological time and mass, and in so doing will provide fairly strong evidence that this conceptual model of relationally structured reality that I am presenting is accurately reflective of what's actually going on beyond the mind projected surface appearance that we refer to as physical reality. As already stated, what this drawing shows is that in order for a third level relational structure to propagate at a faster or slower speed through the first level of relational structure, the maximal distortion components that are repetitively and so periodically interacting as that third level relational structure have to propagate through the first level of relational structure with an increasing or decreasing degree of propagational linearity. And those changes in propagational linearity result in two structural changes taking place. And those two structural changes are: one, a change in the number of maximal distortion quanta of which the third level structure is composed over one third level structural period, and two, a change in the periodicity or periodic activity of that third level structure. As I will now describe, those two structural changes that must take place in order for a third level relational structure to propagate at a faster or slower speed through the first level of relational structure are the underlying basis of Einstein's relativity of mass and time as a function of material speed relative to the speed of light. And that's because, as I will now describe, it is the number of maximal distortion quanta of which a third level relational structure is composed over one third level structural period that is the underlying basis of the material or physical characteristic that it exhibits as mass. And it is this periodic activity that a third level structure undergoes that is the underlying basis of the material or physical characteristic that it exhibits as time. Now we will begin with a description of the underlying basis of mass and mass relativity. Because of the two structural variables just mentioned, the change in the number of maximal distortion quanta that must occur in order to change the propagational linearity and so propagational speed of the third level structure is the easiest to explain and understand. And as can be seen from this drawing, in order for the propagational linearity of a third level relational structure to change, maximal distortion quanta have to be added to or subtracted from that third level structure as it exists during one full third level structural period. Specifically, for the propagational linearity of a third level relational structure to increase, thereby increasing the speed at which that third level structure propagates through the first level of relational structure, maximal distortion quanta have to be added to that third level relational structure as it exists during one full third level structural period. And conversely, for the propagational linearity of a third level relational structure to decrease, thereby decreasing the speed at which that third level structure propagates through the first level of relational structure, maximal distortion quanta have to be subtracted from that third level relational structure as it exists during one full third level structural period. And again, all of this is because third level relational structures are composed of repetitively interacting second level relational structures whose maximal distortion components are always propagating through the first level relational structure at the speed of light. And so you can't change the speed of third level relational structures by making its maximal distortion components go faster or slower. Instead, all you can do is change the degree of propagational linearity of those maximal distortion components, thereby causing the third level relational structure as a whole to propagate either faster or slower, depending on whether you have increased or decreased the propagational linearity of its maximal distortion components. And those changes in propagational linearity cause the third level structure as a whole to propagate faster or slower through the first level of relational structure, because those geometric structural changes cause the third level structure as a whole to propagate either relatively farther or relatively less far as a function of the same exact number of reality cell periods of content exchange, and so as a function of the exact same amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. And here it is important to point out that a third level structure that has a relatively greater degree of propagational linearity, although it will propagate through the first level of relational structure at a faster speed than a third level structure that has a relatively lesser degree of propagational linearity, that faster propagating third level structure does not propagate farther through the first level of relational structure in the same amount of time as the slower propagating third level structure, because the physical characteristic of time does not apply to relationally structured reality, because the physical characteristic of time is ultimately just our perception or etching of a variable feature of third level relational structures, and specifically is our perception or etching of the periodicity or periodic activity that is intrinsic to third level relational structures. And so, even though our minds want to turn around and apply the concept of time to the level of relationally structured reality, such an application can never be accurate because chronological time is not a feature of relationally structured reality. Instead, chronological time is just a physical appearance that has as its basis a feature of relationally structured reality, and specifically has as its most proximal basis the fixed and yet ultimately variable periodic activity of third level relational structures. And that fixed and yet ultimately variable periodic activity has as its basis the fixed and invariant speed of light exchange of reality cell content that is continuously taking place at the first level of relational structure. And that fixed and invariant speed of light exchange of reality cell content that is continuously taking place at the first level of relational structure has as its basis the invariant speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. And so the ultimate basis of any and all relationally structured movement is the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. And so when discussing how fast a relational structure propagates relative to another relational structure, or how much periodic activity a relational structure has relative to another relational structure, what we perceive and conceive as chronological time is not a unit of measure that can be used to determine what constitutes more or less. Because, as I will eventually describe, chronological time is just our perception or etching of a very highly iterated and so highly structured form of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. Instead, the unit of measure that must be used to determine what constitutes more or less at the level of relational structure is the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, as that speed of light movement expresses itself through the continuous exchange of reality cell content. And that is because for reality cells of the same size, the same amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality will cause a distortion of reality cell content, or any reality cell content, to propagate through the same number of reality cells. And so it is that timeless and fundamental movement that is the unit of measure that determines what constitutes more or less at the level of relational structure. That is, does some relational structure or some process that exists within a relational structure take more of that movement or less of that movement? And the only way we can know if some relational structure or some process that exists within a relational structure takes more or less of that movement is by counting how many periods of reality cell content exchange have been produced by that movement with respect to a single reality cell size. Specifically, with respect to a single reality cell size, relatively more reality cell periods of content exchange means relatively more of that movement has occurred, and relatively fewer reality cell periods of content exchange means relatively less of that movement has occurred. That is all. That is our unit of measure, and so that is our unit of more or less with respect to relationally structured reality. You see, our minds want to apply what is a purely created and physical construct to a level of reality where that physical construct does not exist, inasmuch as our minds want to apply the concept of time to the movement of relational structures. But time does not exist at the level of relational structure. What does exist at the level of relational structure is the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. And ultimately, that is all there is at the level of relational structure. And that speed of light movement is timeless, but that timeless speed of light movement eventually becomes structured in a way that makes it possible for our minds to form a relation with that structured movement that produces the physical etching and appearance that we refer to as chronological time. And we then want to take that physical etching and appearance and apply it to the level of reality that is creating that appearance. But at that level of reality, that appearance does not even exist, because all that exists at that level is the timeless and fundamental speed of light movement that is creating the physical surface appearance that we perceive and refer to as the passage or movement of time. And that will become completely clear once I get around to describing exactly what time is an etching of, and so I'm able to show step by step how the timeless and unchanging speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, once it has become relationally structured, functions as a sort of mechanism to produce the variable structural movement that is actually there, where the mind-generated physical and conceptual reality that we refer to as time only appears to be. And we will get to that, but right now we are discussing the structural changes that are the underlying basis of what we perceive at the physical level as the changes in the mass of a material object, and which structural changes third-level relational structures must undergo in order to propagate at a faster or slower speed through the cellular geometry of the first level of relational structure. And so far, what has been stated is that for the propagational linearity of a third-level relational structure to increase, thereby increasing the speed at which that third-level relational structure propagates through the first level of relational structure, maximal distortion quanta have to be added to that third-level relational structure, as it exists throughout one full third-level structural period. And what has also been stated is that for the propagational linearity of a third-level relational structure to decrease, thereby decreasing the speed at which that third-level relational structure propagates through the first level of relational structure, maximal distortion quanta have to be subtracted from that third-level relational structure as it exists throughout one full third-level structural period. And so, as this drawing shows, changing the speed of a third-level relational structure does not change the number of second-level structures of which it is composed, as that number remains fixed. And with regard to this drawing, that number is always 2. However, and this is the vital point, changing the speed of a third-level relational structure requires a change in the number of maximal distortion quanta of which that third-level structure is composed during one full third-level structural period. And that's because the only way the speed of a third level relational structure can change while it still retains the same interactive structure that makes it the specific type of third level structure that it is through an increase or decrease in the propagational linearity of its repetitively interacting maximal distortion components. And that's because you can't change the speed at which those maximal distortion components are propagating because they're always propagating from reality cell to reality cell at the speed of light. And as I will now explain, it is the addition and subtraction of maximal distortion quanta from a third level relational structure that must take place in order for it to propagate faster or slower that is the underlying basis of what we perceive as the increase and decrease in mass that a material object undergoes when its speed increases or decreases. And that's because what the physical characteristic of mass is an etching of at the level of relational structure is the total number of maximal distortion quanta of which a third level structure is composed throughout one full third level structural period. And that's why the rest mass and relativistic mass of an object are different, because the total number of maximal distortion quanta of which a third level structure is composed throughout one full third level structural period must change in order for that object to speed up or slow down. Specifically, the rest mass of an object is the total number of maximal distortion quanta of which a third level relational structure is composed as it exists within a particular relativistic frame of reference, which is a fancy way of saying as it exists within a framework where it is moving at the same speed as everything else around it. And in a particular relativistic frame of reference, all of the maximal distortion components of all the third level structures that are moving at that same speed all have to have the exact same degree of propagational linearity, or else they all would not be moving at that same speed, because the speed at which a third level structure propagates through the first level of relational structure is a function of the degree of propagational linearity of the repetitively interacting maximal distortion components of which it is composed. And now that we understand what rest mass actually is at the level of relational structure, let's look at what relativistic mass actually is. And all that relativistic mass actually is the total number of maximal distortion quanta of which a third level relational structure is composed as it previously existed within a particular relativistic frame of reference, plus or minus the number of maximal distortion quanta that needed to be added to or subtracted from that third level structure in order to increase or decrease the propagational linearity of its repetitively interacting maximal distortion components, thereby speeding it up or slowing it down, which then places it in a different relativistic frame of reference. That's it. That's how simple mass is at the level of relational structure. And just to be clear, what mass is at the level of relational structure is a physical etching of the number of maximal distortion quanta that must exist throughout one third level structural period in order for a third level relational structure to propagate at a particular speed through the first level of relational structure. If you don't believe me, then maybe you'll believe Einstein, who stated that the mass of an object is a measure of its energy content. And if you recall from the second video, each maximal distortion quantum that exists during a third level structural period represents a single quantum of energy, expressed physically as energy equals Planck's constant multiplied by frequency. And so the more maximal distortion quanta of which a third level structure is composed during a third level structural period, the more energy that third level structure will be measured as having when it is perceived as a physical object. And conversely, the fewer maximal distortion quanta of which a third level structure is composed during a third level structural period, the less energy that third level structure will be measured as having when it is perceived as a physical object. And so to summarize, what we measure as mass or as the energy content of matter is actually at the level of relational structure a measure or etching of the number of maximal distortion quanta of which a third level relational structure is composed throughout one full structural period. And that number must change, and so the measured mass of an object must change in order for third level relational structures to propagate faster or slower through the first level of relational structure. Specifically, for a third level relational structure to propagate at a relatively faster speed through the first level of relational structure, that structure must have additional maximal distortion quanta added to its periodic structure in order to increase its propagational linearity, thereby increasing its speed. And those additional maximal distortion quanta then result in that third level structure being measured to have a relatively greater mass when it is translated into a physical appearance by our minds. Conversely, for a third level relational structure to propagate at a relatively slower speed through the first level of relational structure, that structure must have maximal distortion quanta subtracted from its periodic structure in order to decrease its propagational linearity, thereby decreasing its speed. And those subtracted maximal distortion quanta then result in that third level structure being measured to have a relatively lower mass or relatively less energy when it is translated into a physical appearance by our minds. And in order to make what has just been described easier to understand, I'm now going to describe mass primarily in terms of physical reality, while keeping in mind that physical reality is just an etching of what's actually going on at the level of relational structure. And in terms of physical reality, matter is composed of light quanta that have formed stable relations with other light quanta. But the structure of matter is such that those light quanta must exist as light quanta more than one time during any one structural period of that matter. And specifically, those light quanta must exist a fixed and yet ultimately variable number of times during any one structural period of that matter. Fixed because that number is the same while the speed of the matter remains unchanged, and yet ultimately variable because that number can and must change for the speed of matter to change. And the number of times those light quanta exist during a structural period of matter is a function of the speed at which that matter is moving, because that speed is a function of the geometric structure of the matter as it actually exists at the level of relational structure. And how any bit of matter actually exists at the level of relational structure is as a particular geometric arrangement of light quanta, as those light quanta exist not over some period of time, but as a function of some fixed and yet ultimately variable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. Fixed because the amount of that speed of light movement is the same while the speed of the matter remains unchanged, and yet ultimately variable because the amount of that speed of light movement can and must change for the speed of matter to change. And the more light quanta of which a bit of matter is composed over one full structural period, the more mass that matter is measured to have. And the fewer light quanta of which a bit of matter is composed over one full structural period, the less mass that matter is measured to have. That's all. Ultimately, in terms of physical reality, light is energy, and the physical characteristic of mass is a measure of that energy as it is repetitively interacting as matter. And so it's a particular number of light quanta, and that is why E equals mc squared, which is to say why energy equals mass times the speed of light times the speed of light. And now that we know what mass is, we can substitute the energy equation for light for mass in Einstein's energy equation for matter by substituting hxf for m, where x represents the number of light quanta of which a bit of matter is composed over one full structural period, which leaves us with E equals xhf times c. And that mathematical substitution makes it easier to see that the energy of matter is not arrived at by just adding up all the energy of the light quanta of which it is actually composed, but is instead arrived at by adding up the energy of all those light quanta expressed as mass, and then multiplying that amount by the interactive relationship that those quanta have with each other while functioning as some bit of matter, and which interactive relationship is expressed as c squared, or c times c. Because what the c squared in E equals mc squared represents is the particular way that the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality has become structured while functioning as a third level of relational structure. And the way that fundamental movement has become structured is as a repetitive and so periodic interaction that is taking place between a certain number of second level relational structures that each exist as a certain number of maximal distortion quanta throughout one full third level structural period. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the underlying relational structure of matter is reflected in Einstein's E equals mc squared energy equation for matter, not by coincidence. Instead, the relational structure of matter is reflected in Einstein's E equals mc squared as a function of the fact that what energy equations ultimately are statements translated into physical terms and characteristics of the particular way the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality is functioning as a particular level of relational structure. For example, the energy equation for light is E equals hf, or energy equals Planck's constant multiplied by frequency. And as I described in the second video, that energy equation is reflective of the way the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality is functioning as the maximal distortion component of a second-level relational structure, since what h, or Planck's constant, represents is that maximal distortion component, and what f represents is the frequency at which that maximal distortion is propagating from reality cell to reality cell. And so what E equals mc squared represents is how the maximal distortion components of second-level relational structures repetitively interact with each other in order to function as a third level of relational structure, which is to say, as a third way the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality has become progressively structured as a function of its movement in relation to itself. Ultimately, what Einstein's E equals mc squared equation showed was that all matter is just a form of energy. And what I am in the middle of doing is showing that all of physical reality beyond its surface appearance is just a structured form of the speed of light movement of the fundamental and formless reality that we refer to as awareness. And I am doing that by describing the nature of the relational structures that are actually there where space, light, and matter appear to be, and then relating those structures to physical reality, thereby revealing the actual and underlying structural basis of why the energy equations for light and matter exist as they do. Because all of the fundamental physical equations have as their actual and underlying basis the relational structure of reality that's actually there where physical reality only appears to be. Otherwise, they wouldn't work. And right now, science has the equations, but it knows nothing of the structure of reality that is actually there. And so science has become very good at manipulating relationally structured reality, although it continues to have no idea whatsoever regarding the nature of the reality that it is actually dealing with while working with what appears to be physical reality. Put another way, science mistakenly believes that the physical equations it uses actually pertain to physical reality, because it continues to mistakenly believe that physical reality is the reality that's actually there. But what I am showing is that what's actually there, where physical reality only appears to be, is a progressively and relationally structured formless reality that's moving at the speed of light. Physical equations express consistent relationships that exist between different physical characteristics, but those different physical characteristics aren't what's actually there, because what's actually there is some aspect of the relational awareness structures that are actually there where physical reality appears to be. And so what physical equations actually express are consistent relationships that exist between different aspects of the relational awareness structures that are actually there. And that's why those equations work, and that's why science works, even though science continues to have no understanding whatsoever of the actual nature of reality, because it is completely caught up and lost in the mind-generated physical and mental surface appearances, because humanity remains completely caught up and lost in the mind-generated physical and mental surface appearances. And that has created a vicious cycle of self-ignorance, because science is the most reliable means we have for dealing with and understanding reality, because science deals with physical facts, and physical facts cannot tell a lie as a function of their method of creation. But physical facts can be assembled into all sorts of conceptual bullshit that has nothing to do with reality, because conceptual reality can lie quite freely and incessantly as a function of its method of creation, which is through a game of connect the dots that we play with physical facts. And the idea that physical reality is an objective representation of reality is not a fact, but is complete and utter mind-generated conceptual bullshit that is mistakenly treated as if it were an established fact. And I've already clearly demonstrated in the book that physical objectivity or physical realism is complete bullshit, and I am in the process of demonstrating that same thing here in this series of videos. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because, more than anything else, it is the mistaken idea and so mistaken belief that physical reality is an objective representation of reality, and so is in some way, shape, or form the reality that's actually there, that is keeping human awarenesses, and so human beings, effectively trapped within mind-generated experiential environments, completely unaware of the reality that is both actually there and what they really are, where they then suffer. And I love science. And so it pains me to no end that science right now is functioning as an instrument of self-ignorance, rather than as the instrument of self-knowledge that it is supposed to be and easily can be if it were to just stop treating the assumption of physical objectivity as if it were an established fact, so that human beings can begin to see reality in a way that reveals rather than conceals the reality that's both actually there and what we really are. As I said in the first video, we are not living in an age of scientific enlightenment, but are actually living in what is just a more technologically advanced version of the Dark Ages, where we continue to have no understanding whatsoever regarding the actual nature of reality. Because all we did was trade in our old set of religious-based fairy tales regarding the nature of reality for a new set of physical fact-based and so science-based fairy tales regarding the nature of reality. Materialism is a fairy tale. The probabilistic interpretation of quantum reality is a fairy tale. The idea that physical reality somehow creates the consciousness that is aware of physical reality is a fairy tale. And just because they teach this stuff in schools and universities all over the world does not magically convert these fairy tales into truth, since they remain fairy tales no matter how many people believe them to be true. And people believe in these fairy tales as truth because that's what they are taught. And then they teach the next generation the same set of fairy tales. And on it goes, leaving human awarenesses effectively trapped in those fairy tales, which is to say, effectively trapped in those inaccurate conceptual realities, believing them to be scientifically verified and established facts, when all they really are is mind-generated conceptual bullshit that has been constructed by inaccurately connecting scientifically verified and established facts. And again, this is not to bash science or to make the case that vaccines aren't safe or that global warming isn't real, because they are and it is. Science is the way forward, but right now science is caught in a conceptual loop that is keeping humanity trapped in that same conceptual loop, because science is the means by which people tend to learn what reality is. And right now science has no idea whatsoever regarding the actual nature of reality. And that's because science continues to cling to the notion of physical objectivity and so continues to interpret and conceptually assemble all the physical facts it generates within what is ultimately a completely inaccurate conceptual context. And that has left scientists with no choice other than to convert the physical facts they uncover into complete and utter mind-generated bullshit with respect to the nature of reality, because it is simply not possible to accurately interpret physical facts with respect to the nature of reality while operating within a conceptual context where physical reality is misconceived as being in some way, shape, or form objectively representative of the reality that's actually there. Instead, what happens is they just end up connecting those facts in a way that seems to make sense from within that inaccurate conceptual context, leaving them with the mistaken impression that they now have a deeper understanding of the nature of reality, when all they've really done is generate another fairy tale that seems to reinforce the fairy tale from within which they are already unknowingly operating, which then leaves their awarenesses trapped even more deeply and firmly within that fairy tale. And materialism is the fairy tale from within which scientists presently operate. And that fairy tale has as its basis the fairy tale of physical objectivity or physical realism, which are formalizations of the mistaken idea that physical reality is in some way, shape, or form the reality that's actually there. And the probabilistic interpretation of quantum reality is the fairy tale that scientists were forced to come up with as a result of being forced to assemble the quantum physical facts into a conception of reality while operating from within the fairy tale of materialism. And Einstein knew that the probabilistic interpretation of quantum reality was a fairy tale, which is why he never went along with it. And Einstein knew that the probabilistic interpretation of quantum reality was a fairy tale because he knew that reality had an unseen and unseeable structure, and that the equations that he came up with were somehow reflective of that unseen structure and the way in which it operated as the related and perceivable realities of space, light, and matter. And because he was Einstein, he likely recognized that physical reality could not be both the result of a fundamental structure and also be fundamentally probabilistic, which is to say, maybe this or perhaps that, because structures are what they are and do not exist in the state of maybe this or perhaps that. And so Einstein chose structural reality over probabilistic reality, even though all the other scientists went along with the probabilistic interpretation of reality. And Einstein most likely chose structural reality over probabilistic reality because he was only able to do what he did with his relativity theories because he had, to some degree, seen past the physical surface appearance and into the structure that is actually there beyond that appearance. And so to him, the idea that physical reality could in some way be fundamentally probabilistic or exist in a state of maybe this or perhaps that was completely incompatible with his notion and recognition that reality had a fundamental structure. And I already demonstrated in the book that Einstein was correct and that the probabilistic interpretation of quantum reality is complete bullshit, meaning that the reality that's actually there, where any probabilistic quantum physical reality appears to be, does not in any way, shape, or form exist in a state of maybe this or perhaps that, but has a definite non physical structure that, when translated or etched into a physical appearance, can appear as either a determinate and predictable physical reality or as an indeterminate and so unpredictable physical reality, depending upon a particular structural condition that either does or does not exist when an observer impactively interacts with whatever non-physical relational structure is actually there. And in video 6, I will describe in detail the structural relation that relationally structured reality is able to form with itself that makes it possible for the fundamental reality to produce the mind-generated appearance that we, as the fundamental reality, are aware of and refer to as physical reality. And in that video, I will also describe in detail the structural condition that either is or is not present when that physical experience producing structural relation takes place, describing both how the presence of that structural condition causes the created physical reality to appear predictable and so determinate in nature, and how the absence of that structural condition causes the created physical reality to appear unpredictable and so probabilistic in nature, thereby creating the appearance and so illusion that quantum level reality is somehow probabilistic in nature, in which appearance and illusion functions as a reality obscuring delusion if one makes the mistake of believing that the created physical appearances are objectively representative of the reality that's actually there. But in order to establish the conceptual context that will make it possible for that description to be understood, I first have to describe the structure of reality that's actually there, where physical reality, both determinate and indeterminate, or predictable and probabilistic, only appears to be. And right now I'm in the process of describing that unseen structure and relating the existence and functioning of that structure to certain physical characteristics that exist as etchings of certain aspects of that structure, in order to provide evidence that the story I'm telling is not just another fairy tale that has been constructed by inaccurately connecting what are accurate and truthful physical facts. And right now I am in the middle of describing how that unseen structure functions as a third level of relational structure that contains a fixed number of maximal distortion quanta throughout one full structural period, and how that fixed number of maximal distortion quanta must change in order for a third level structure to propagate faster or slower through the first level of relational structure. And I will now provide additional evidence that my description of what mass actually is at the level of relational structure is an accurate description, by showing why Einstein was correct when he calculated that it is not possible for matter to travel at the speed of light, because to do so its mass would have to become infinite, meaning that it would take an infinite amount of energy for any bit of matter to propagate at the speed of light. Put another way, the only physical realities that can travel at the speed of light are particles that have no mass, and you are about to find out exactly why that is in terms of progressively and relationally structured reality. Again, science knows a lot about what is and is not possible, but science doesn't know much of anything at all with regard to why things are and are not possible, because right now all it has are equations that state consistent and so factual relationships that exist between certain physical characteristics. But what I am describing is the underlying structure that is not only the basis of certain physical characteristics, but is also the basis of the relations those characteristics have to each other. And so what I am describing is the underlying structure that is the basis of the equations that state those consistent relations, thereby making it possible for you to see exactly why those physical characteristics are related in the way that the equations say they are. In any case, if a physical reality has mass, that can only be because underlying that physical reality are the maximal distortion components of two or more second-level relational structures repetitively and so periodically interacting as a third level, relational structure. And that's because the reality that we refer to as mass does not even exist until third level relational structures exist, because it is not until third level relational structures come into existence that maximal distortion quanta exist in the particular way that they must exist in order to be physically etched as the physical characteristic and reality that we refer to as mass. In the particular way that maximal distortion quanta must exist in order to be physically etched as mass is as a fixed and yet ultimately variable number of maximal distortion quanta throughout one full third level structural period. Maximal distortion quanta are one of the two components of which second level relational structures are composed, and so maximal distortion quanta exists prior to the emergence and so existence of third level relational structures. But a maximal distortion quantum that is functioning only as part of a second level relational structure does not function in a way that produces the physical reality that we call mass, because the number of maximal distortion quanta of which a second level relational structure is composed is always the same, and that number is 1. Conversely, the number of maximal distortion quanta of which any third level relational structure is composed is always greater than 2, and that number can and must change in order for any third level structure to propagate faster or slower through the first level of relational structure. And so the exact same underlying reality, and which underlying reality I am referring to as a maximal distortion quantum, functions in two different ways and so produces two different physical appearances when it is functioning only as part of a second level relational structure and when it is functioning along with the maximal distortion quantum of another second level relational structure to help compose a third level relational structure. Specifically, when functioning only as part of a second level relational structure, a maximal distortion quantum produces the physical appearance of a massless particle that is referred to as a photon or a light quantum. And when functioning as part of a third level relational structure, a maximal distortion quantum, along with at least one other maximal distortion quantum, helps produce the physical appearance that we refer to as mass, and so helps produce the physical appearance of particles that have mass. And so now, all that having been stated, let's look at why third level relational structures, which we perceive as matter or as particles that have mass, cannot propagate at the speed of light or at the same speed as massless particles, because doing so would require an infinite amount of energy, because doing so would require their mass to become infinite. This drawing shows the most basic and fundamental third level structure being accelerated from left to right, and eventually on the far right propagating at the speed of light. However, as this drawing shows or implies, the only way for a third level relational structure to propagate at the speed of light is for its maximal distortion components to propagate with complete linearity. However, here's the rub with regard to that. If the maximal distortion components that make up a third level structure were to all propagate with complete linearity, the third level structural period of that third level structure would never end. And so the number of maximal distortion quanta that would need to be added to that third level structure in order to produce that unending third level structural period would also have no end, and so that number would be mathematically infinite, thereby making its mass infinite, and so making the energy that would need to be added to that structure to achieve that infinite mass also infinite. And that's the underlying non-physical and relationally structured reason why anything that has mass cannot propagate at the speed of light. Because anything that has mass has to be composed of two or more maximal distortion components that are repetitively and so periodically interacting while propagating non-linearly at the speed of light. And if you take away that propagational nonlinearity so that the maximal distortion components then propagate with complete linearity, then you have taken away from that third level relational structure the very thing that causes those maximal distortion components to function as a third level relational structure that is composed over one full structural period of a fixed and yet ultimately variable and also finite number of maximal distortion quanta. Because the thing that causes maximal distortion components to function as a third level relational structure is their nonlinear speed of light propagation. Because it is that nonlinear speed of light propagation that allows those maximal distortion components to repetitively spin about or orbit each other, and in so doing exist periodically as a fixed and yet ultimately variable and so finite number of maximal distortion quanta, which, when translated to the level of physical reality, appears as a fixed and yet ultimately variable and also finite amount of mass. It's a beautiful thing to pull aside the curtain of physical reality and see how the underlying and fundamental reality functions. And doing so is all about understanding the anatomy and functioning of the relational awareness structures that are actually there where any mind-generated physical reality only appears to be. And I've just used the anatomy of third-level relational structures to explain what mass really is and why it changes in the way we perceive it to change, and in the way that Einstein calculated and predicted that it must change as a function of material speed relative to the speed of light. And what I have now explained about what light and mass really are at the level of relational structure also explains why Max Planck found that energy was quantized and could be emitted or absorbed only in integral multiples of a small unit of energy, known as a quantum. And he discovered that because, as you can now see and understand, what's actually there where any bit of matter or particle that has mass appears to be is a third level relational structure that is composed throughout one full structural period of a certain number of maximal distortion quanta. And it is those maximal distortion quanta as they come and go that we perceive as the quantized absorption and emission of energy from a material system. And now that I've explained what mass actually is in terms of the periodic anatomy of third level relational structures, I will now use that same anatomical description to explain what chronological time actually is and why it changes in the way Einstein calculated and predicted that it must change as a function of material speed relative to the speed of light. And what I'm going to show is that the feature or characteristic of physical reality that we refer to as chronological time, which we perceive as the periodic movement of the hands of a clock or as the periodic movement of celestial objects, has as its most proximal basis the fixed and yet ultimately variable periodicity of third level relational structures. And I say as its most proximal basis because, as I will also show, that fixed and yet ultimately variable periodicity, and so the movement or passage of time, has as its ultimate basis the constant, non-periodic, and timeless speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. Basically, the underlying basis of the physical reality that we refer to as time, just like mass, does not even exist until third level relational structures exist. And so the physical and conceptual reality that we call time only exists with respect to third level structures, in the same way that mass only exists with respect to third level structures. That is, just as the concept of mass does not apply to the first and second levels of relational structure, the concept of time does not apply to the first and second levels of relational structure. And what that means is that, contrary to popular and scientific belief, time is not a fourth dimension of space. Put another way, the fixed and yet ultimately variable periodic movement that we perceive and conceive as time, or as the movement or passage of time, has as its ultimate basis the fixed and invariant speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, as that speed of light movement functions as the first two levels of relational structure that are actually there where physical space and light appear to be. But the relationally structured aspect of that fundamental speed of light movement that functions most directly, almost proximally, as the underlying basis of the physical etching or appearance that we perceive and conceive as the movement of time, just does not exist at the first and second levels of relational awareness structure, but only comes into existence or emerges into reality as a structural aspect of third level relational structures. Put yet another way, the fundamental speed of light movement that ultimately and eventually produces the underlying structural characteristic that we perceive and conceive as time is a dimension of space, so to speak, because as I explained in the last video, what we perceive as physical space is actually a relationally structured form of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. But the periodic physical movement that we perceive and conceive as time, or as the passage of time, is not a dimension of space, because time is a physical etching that can only be produced once that speed of light movement is functioning as a third level of relational structure. And so what we have done by misconceiving time as being a fourth dimension of space is take what is itself just a physical etching of a particular characteristic of a particular level of relationally structured reality and then apply that etching to a level of reality where the underlying structure that is the basis of that etching simply does not exist. And the reason I am taking the time to explain how we have misconceived time prior to actually naming and describing the relatively simple third level structural characteristic that time is a physical etching of is because if there is to be any hope of human beings understanding the concepts that I am attempting to transfer to their minds, I can't just state what is going on, but I also have to unravel and unwind some of the bullshit that human beings have been taught to believe about the nature of reality as a result of our mistakenly believing that physical reality is the reality that's actually there. Because again, I'm not trying to convey these concepts to individuals who have no knowledge regarding the nature of reality, but am trying to convey these concepts to individuals whose minds are filled with false and mistaken concepts regarding the nature of reality, most of which are completely contrary to the concepts that I am attempting to transfer. And if you continue to cling to those false concepts, then it will simply not be possible for you to understand the concepts that I am attempting to convey. Because clinging to those false concepts effectively traps your awareness in a conceptual context that is completely contrary to and so incompatible with the conceptual context that you need to be operating from within in order to understand the concepts that I'm attempting to convey. And again, that's just how our minds work, and there's no getting around it. And it is because our minds work in that way that the physicist Max Planck of Planck's constant fame observed that a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. You see, people think that scientists want to discover new and amazing stuff that gives them insights into the nature of reality, and that's true up to a point. And it's only true up to a point because most scientists, like most people, only really want to discover new and amazing stuff that gives them insights into the nature of reality when that new and amazing stuff aligns with and so confirms what they already believe about the nature of reality, and so is compatible with the conceptual context in which they are already operating. And what most people do when new, amazing, and more accurate stuff comes along that contradicts what they already believe about the nature of reality is they either ignore it or label it as false, because from within the conceptual context in which they are operating, the new information that contradicts their belief must appear as false, and so they naturally reject it. And when the new information can't be rejected outright because it can't be completely denied, it is then usually twisted, contorted, and distorted in some way so that it can appear to align with one's belief. And so the reason people sometimes literally have to die in order for a more accurate interpretation of reality to finally be accepted is because as long as you continue to believe in a concept, your awareness must operate from within a conceptual context that aligns with that concept. And while operating from within that conceptual context, any opposing or contradictory concept must appear as untrue and false when viewed through the filter of the concept that you believe to be true and accurate. And so people tend to not let go of false concepts they believe in, especially if those concepts have become linked to their mind-generated concept of self or ego, and so have become integral to their mind-generated concept of self. Because then, even just questioning the false concept brings into question their own sense of self. And I don't know if you've noticed, but most people do not like to have what they believe themselves to be brought into question. There's a reason human awarenesses have been effectively trapped in mind-generated physical and mental realities for thousands of years, despite all the suffering that being trapped in those realities produces, and despite all the different and relatively accurate explanations that we have been given by various individuals over the years who managed to free themselves from their mind-generated cages and then tried to tell us what was really going on and what we really are. And that reason is that the conceptual mind cages in which we are effectively trapped operate in a way that only allows us to see reality in a way that aligns with and so reinforces the beliefs we have used and are using to build and maintain those conceptual cages. And so these tangential rants serve a purpose, and that purpose is to try to get you to loosen your grip on something that you have been taught to believe about the nature of reality that is completely inaccurate and so is complete and utter bullshit. So there is at least a chance that you will make an attempt to understand the opposite concept that I am trying to convey about the nature of reality instead of just automatically and reflexively labeling it as false. In any case, time is related to space, but time is in no way, shape, or form a fourth dimension of space. And again, time is related to space because the self relational speed of light movement of which space is actually constructed beyond its physical surface appearance is the driving force behind the fixed and yet ultimately variable periodic activity of third level relational structures. And as I am finally about to describe, what we perceive and conceive as the passage of time is ultimately nothing more than our physical etching of the fixed and yet ultimately variable periodic activity of the third level structures that are actually there wherever any bit of matter or particle that has mass appears to be. Clocks measure the thing we call time. But what are clocks really? All clocks really are periodic activity generators that are able to be synchronized to the periodic movement of certain celestial objects. A single rotation of the Earth on its axis takes the amount of time that we call a day, and a single orbit of the Earth around the Sun takes the amount of time that we call a year. And so, what we perceive and measure as time has as its basis our perception of periodic activity that we observe taking place in physical reality. But anything that we perceive as a physical reality is not the reality that's actually there, but is only an etching of some relationally structured reality or characteristic that is actually there. And what I'm about to explain and demonstrate is that the periodic activity that we observe taking place in physical reality, and which periodic activity we perceive and conceive as the passage of time, is our physical etching of a fixed and yet ultimately variable periodic activity that only third level relational structures possess. And third level relational structures possess a fixed and yet ultimately variable periodic activity as a function of the way in which they are created as a result of repetitive and so periodic relations that the maximal distortion components of second level relational structures are able to form with each other. And so the only thing we need to do in order to pull aside the curtain of the abstract physical reality that we call time so that we can see what's actually there is describe the fixed and yet ultimately variable periodic activity that is intrinsic to third level relational structures, and then describe how that periodic activity becomes more or less, and so changes when third level structures propagate slower or faster through the first level of relational structure. As I've already stated, what defines a particular third level relational structure is the geometric arrangement of the number of maximal distortion quanta of which it is composed throughout one full third level structural period. And what defines one full third level structural period is the same sort of thing that defines 1 year, and that thing is one full cycle of orbiting of one thing around another thing. And the things that fully orbit or cycle around each other and in so doing define one third level structural period are the maximal distortion components of the second level relational structures that are repetitively and so periodically interacting as a third level relational structure. And so, as this drawing shows, one third level structural period is defined by one full orbit or spiral of its maximal distortion components around each other. And in order to produce that full orbit or spiral of its maximal distortion components around each other, each maximal distortion component must exist as a particular number of maximal distortion quanta during that third level structural period. And that third level structural period does not take place over some period of time and so does not take time in order to happen. Instead, that third level structural period is the underlying basis of the physical etching and reality that we perceive and conceive as time. And what it takes in order for that structural period to happen is some fixed and yet ultimately variable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, because it is that fundamental speed of light movement that causes each maximal distortion component to propagate from reality cell to reality cell at the speed of light, and so exist as a certain number of maximal distortion quanta during a third level structural period. And what this drawing also shows is that the changes in the propagational linearity of its maximal distortion components that must take place in order for a third level structure to propagate faster or slower through the first level of relational structure produce changes in the periodic activity of that third level structure. As I will soon demonstrate, the reason the physical reality of time is relative to material speed is as a result of the changes in third level relational structure periodicity that must take place in order for third level structures to propagate faster or slower through the first level of relational structure. But in order to demonstrate that, I first need to describe the way in which the periodic activity of third level relational structures changes as a result of changes in the propagational linearity of its maximal distortion components. And the way the periodic activity of third level relational structures changes as a result of changes in the propagational linearity of its maximal distortion components is that periodic activity becomes relatively more or less, or happens relatively faster or slower, but not more or less or faster or slower in terms of time, but more or less or faster or slower relative to a fixed amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. Specifically, and as this drawing shows from left to right, in order for a third level relational structure to propagate faster, the propagational linearity of its maximal distortion components has to increase. And as explained earlier, that increase in propagational linearity is accomplished by adding maximal distortion quanta to each maximal distortion component during a structural period, thereby increasing the characteristic of that third level structure that we perceive as mass. And conversely, as this drawing also shows from right to left, in order for a third level relational structure to propagate slower, the propagational linearity of its maximal distortion components has to decrease. And as explained earlier, that decrease in propagational linearity is accomplished by subtracting maximal distortion quanta from each maximal distortion component during a structural period, thereby decreasing the characteristic of that third level structure that we perceive as mass. And what I'm now going to explain are the changes in third level structure periodicity or periodic activity that must accompany those changes in propagational linearity, because it is those changes in periodicity that are the underlying basis of what we perceive as the change in the amount or rate of time matter undergoes or exhibits when its speed changes. And that is because, as stated earlier, the physical reality that we perceive and conceive as time has as its most proximal basis the fixed and yet variable periodic activity of the third level relational structures that are actually there where any physical object appears to be. Specifically, as propagational linearity increases, which occurs as we move from left to right in this drawing, third level relational structure periodicity decreases or becomes relatively less, because it then takes relatively more of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality for a third level relational structure to undergo a full structural period. Conversely, as propagational linearity decreases, which occurs as we move from right to left in this drawing, third level relational structure periodicity increases or becomes relatively more, because it then takes relatively less of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality for a third level relational structure to undergo a full structural period. And as shown in this drawing, what that means is that, given a fixed and yet undefinable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, which is indicated in this drawing by the red, green, and blue spheres, a third level structure that is propagating through the first level of relational structure with a relatively higher degree of propagational linearity will undergo relatively fewer third level structural periods, while a third level structure that is propagating through the first level of relational structure with a relatively lower degree of propagational linearity will undergo relatively more third level structural periods. And it is the number of times that a third level structure completes a full structural period given a fixed and yet undefinable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality that determines the rate of time that that third level structure displays when etched as a physical reality. Specifically, the relatively more times a third level structure completes a full structural period given a fixed and yet undefinable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, the relatively faster the rate of time that third level structure displays when etched as a physical reality. And conversely, the relatively fewer times a third level structure completes a full structural period given a fixed and yet undefinable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, the relatively slower the rate of time that third level structure displays when etched as a physical reality. And so, more or less time does not occur as the result of more or fewer third level structural periods given the same amount of time. Instead, more or less time occurs as the result of more or fewer third level structural periods given the same amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. Because given the same amount of that speed of light movement, more structural periods equals a relatively faster rate of time or more time, and fewer structural periods equals a relatively slower rate of time or less time when third level structural periodicity is translated by our minds to the physical level and so then exists as the physical etching or appearance that we refer to as chronological time. And in order to make this relativity of time as a function of third level relational structure periodicity more concrete, let's use a rocket ship analogy. People on Earth all exist in the same relativistic frame of reference because we are all moving at pretty much the same speed relative to the speed of light. And in a particular relativistic frame of reference, the rate of time does not change because propagational linearity does not change, and so third level structure periodicity does not change. And so people on Earth all age at the same rate or get older at the same rate as a function of what we perceive and conceive as the passage or movement of time. But now let's say that a group of people get on a rocket ship that immediately accelerates to a speed where the propagational linearity of the relativistic frame of reference they now exist in has increased to the point where third level structural periodicity is now one half of what it was on Earth, meaning that, given a fixed and yet undefinable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, the third level structures that are actually there, where the bodies of the people on the rocket ship appear to be, only undergo one full structural period for every two structural periods that the bodies of the people still on Earth undergo. And let's say that while moving at that speed, the rocket ship does a big loop and returns to Earth after a period of time that the clocks on the ship indicate was 1 month. But on Earth, the rate of time was twice as fast because the third level structural periodicity on Earth was 2 times what it was on the rocket ship. And so the period of time the clocks on Earth would register as having gone by is 2 months. And so the bodies of the people on the ship would have aged 1 month less than they would have aged if they remained on Earth, even though both sets of bodies would have been kept intact by the exact same amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, because the bodies on the rocket ship only underwent one structural period for every two structural periods the bodies on Earth underwent as a function of that speed of light movement. So if there were identical twins, the twin who stayed on Earth would now be a month older than the twin who got on the ship, even though they were born on the same day, because the one who got on the ship would have been temporarily in a relativistic frame of reference where the third level structures of which their body is composed would have undergone only one half of the third level periods that their twin would have undergone while on Earth. And so even though the bodies of both twins would be propagated through space by the exact same amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, that exact same amount of that speed of light movement would produce twice as much time on Earth as it did on the rocket ship, because that exact same amount of that speed of light movement would produce twice as much third level periodic activity on Earth as it did on the rocket ship. And that exact same amount of that speed of light movement would produce twice as much third level periodic activity on Earth as it did on the rocket ship, because the propagational linearity of the rocket ship and all the third level structures within it would have increased to the point where their third level structural periodicity would be one half of what it was on Earth. So to summarize, the rate of time would change because third level structural periodicity would change, and third level structural periodicity would change because propagational linearity would change, and propagational linearity would change because that's what has to change in order for third level structures to propagate faster or slower through the first level of relational structure. And so now, all that having been explained, let's use a drawing that shows how progressively and relationally structured reality functions as a sort of clockwork mechanism that converts the invariant speed of light movement of the fundamental reality into the variable periodic movement that is the underlying basis of the movement that we perceive as the passage of time. Now, the clock in this drawing only has one hand because all we are concerned with is how relatively fast or slow that one hand turns, because all we are concerned with is observing how the rate of time is able to change while the amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality remains the same. And this clock has three different levels of gears, two of which have an invariant periodicity and one of which has a variable periodicity. The first two levels of gears are the first and second levels of relational structure, and the periodicity of those two levels of gears does not change, which means that a given amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality always produces the exact same amount of periodic movement within those structures. And so even though reality cells of different sizes may have different periodicities or frequencies of content exchange, the same amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality always produces the same periodicity or frequency with respect to a given reality cell size. But the same is not true with respect to the third gear level, which is the third level of relational structure, because the periodic activity of those third level gears can and must change if the speed at which that gear is propagating through the first level of relational structure changes. And when the periodic activity of those third level gears changes, the rate of time changes, because what we perceive as the movement of the hand of time is most proximally or most directly turned by those third level gears, although time as a movement is ultimately powered or driven by the invariant speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. Time is just our perception of that invariant movement functioning as a third level of relational structure. In any case, if the material speed of this clock or any clock remains unchanged, then the rate of time it expresses does not change. However, if the material speed of this clock or any clock increases, then the rate of time it expresses is relatively less, and so the hand of time moves relatively slower than it did before, because in order for any clock to propagate faster through the first level of relational structure, the third level structures of which that clock is actually composed have to undergo structural changes that result in those third level structures undergoing relatively fewer third level structural periods, given a fixed and yet undefinable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. And those relatively fewer third level structural periods translate to the hand of the clock turning relatively slower, and so expressing a relatively slower rate of time. Conversely, if the speed of propagation of this clock or any clock decreases, then the rate of time it expresses is relatively more, and so the hand of time moves relatively faster than it did before, because in order for any clock to propagate slower through the first level of relational structure, the third level structures of which that clock is actually composed have to undergo structural changes that result in those third level structures undergoing relatively more third level structural periods, given a fixed and yet undefinable amount of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. And that relatively greater number of third level structural periods translates to the hand of the clock turning relatively faster, and so expressing a relatively faster rate of time. And so all chronological time is a physically perceivable variable periodic movement that exists as the result of the imperceptible, non-physical variable periodic movement of the third level relational structures that are actually there where any physical object, and so any clock of any sort, appears to be. Put more succinctly and more crudely, time ain't shit, and certainly isn't the mythical fourth dimension of space that it is presently believed to be, because absent the third level of relational structure, there is no such thing as time, because absent the third level of relational structure, there is no such thing as variable structural periodicity. And that is why, as Einstein calculated, if matter were to somehow do the impossible and travel at the speed of light, no time would pass for that matter. And no time would pass for that matter traveling at the speed of light, for the same underlying structural reason that the mass of an object traveling at the speed of light would become infinite. And that same underlying structural reason is because the complete propagational linearity that would be required for a third level relational structure to travel at the speed of light would mean there would be no end to that third level structure's structural period, in which case that third level structure would cease to have any third level periodic activity, and so would express nothing that could be perceived as time, since time is our perception of the fixed and yet ultimately variable periodic activity of third level relational structures. In short, take away the periodicity of third level relational structures through complete propagational linearity, and you take away time, because what we perceive as time is ultimately a function of the fixed and yet ultimately variable periodic activity of the third level structures that are actually there where we perceive any bit of matter to be. Or in terms of this drawing, if the third level of gears stops turning because they are no longer undergoing any periodic activity owing to their complete propagational linearity, then the hand of time stops turning, even though the first two levels of gears continue to crank away at the exact same speed or with the exact same periodicity. It's just that now that first and second level cranking or periodic activity is no longer producing third level periodic activity, and so is no longer producing the underlying reality that is the most proximal basis of what we perceive as time or as the passage of time. And so, the variable physical reality of movement that we perceive and conceive as chronological time is not a movement that is integral to the structure of reality. However, the variable physical reality of movement that we perceive and conceive as chronological time has as its ultimate basis the singular and invariant speed of light movement that is as integral to the structure of reality as it can possibly be, inasmuch as the structure of reality is composed of that speed of light movement. Put another way, time is the perceptual end result of movement, but time itself is not the mover or that which is actually moving. That which is the mover and that which is actually moving is the same thing that is always moving because it's the only thing there actually is, and that's the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. Time is just our perception of that speed of light movement as it is functioning as a third level of relational structure, and so as a structure that has a fixed and yet ultimately variable periodicity. In a very real way, third level relational structures function like a sort of mechanical governor that allows for alterations in the speed of a turntable given a fixed amount of energetic input. Except in the case of third level structures functioning as a mechanical governor, what is altered is not the rate of spin, instead, what is altered is the rate of time itself. And the fixed energetic input that ultimately causes time to spin or puts time into motion is not physical energy, but is the unchanging speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. And it is some relationally structured form of that unchanging movement that is actually there wherever we perceive any form of physical energy or physical force to be. And that unchanging speed of light movement, when functioning as a third level relational structure, functions like a mechanical governor, and so functions as a structure that has a variable periodicity, and so functions as a structure that expresses the variable rate of periodic movement that we perceive and conceive as chronological time. And that human beings invented mechanical governors whose periodicity can be changed in order to convert a fixed energetic input into a variable periodic output is not coincidence, but is a function of the fact that the universe, beyond its physical surface appearance, has structurally evolved and continues to structurally evolve as the result of an iterative process. And iterative processes produce the geometric structures referred to as fractals, and fractals exhibit a property referred to as self-similarity, which means that certain patterns tend to be repeated at different levels of iteration within a given fractal structure. And so what I'm saying is that the invention of mechanical governors by human beings is the repetition at a much higher level of iteration of the more fundamental iteration of self-relation that caused third level relational structures to emerge into the structure of reality. Because third level relational structures are the mechanical governors that convert the fixed and non-physical energetic input, that is the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality, into the variable periodic output that is the underlying basis of what we perceive and conceive as the movement or passage of time. That's it. That's mass and mass relativity and time and temporal relativity fully explained in terms of the progressive and relational structure of reality that's actually there, where mind-generated physical reality only appears to be. And so you don't need complex mathematical equations to understand either mass or mass relativity or time or temporal relativity. Instead, all you need is an understanding of the way the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality functions as the third level relational structures that are actually there where any physical object or particle that has mass appears to be. And third level relational structures exist most proximally as a function of a repetitive and so periodic relation that two or more second level relational structures are able to form with each other. And second level relational structures are composed of two interrelated components, one of which is a linearly propagating maximal distortion component, and the other of which is a radially propagating, exponentially diminishing, less than maximal distortion component. However, in order to describe what the physical realities of mass and time are derived from at the level of relational structure, we focus solely on the way the maximal distortion components of second level structures repetitively interact to produce a geometric structure that exists as a third level of relational structure that periodically propagates to the first level of relational structure. But now we're going to switch gears in order to describe what the physical realities of gravity and inertia are derived from at the level of relational structure, because that description requires that we turn our attention to what happens to the radially propagating, exponentially diminishing, less than maximal distortion components of second level relational structures when those structures become involved in these stable relations with each other that constitute what has just been described as a third level relational structure. And what happens to those radially propagating, exponentially diminishing, less than maximal distortion components is that they all combine or summate with each other to produce a radially propagating, exponentially diminishing, less than maximal distortion field that ends up elliptically surrounding the repetitively interacting maximal distortion components. And at the physical level, such radially propagating, exponentially diminishing, less than maximal distortion fields are perceived and conceived as gravitational fields, or as the force of gravity. And so what I'm going to do now is explain the underlying and relationally structured basis of the force of gravity by explaining why it always exists in association with matter and why it functions as an attractive force. Now, as I've already mentioned, the reason gravitational fields exist in association with matter is because radially propagating less than maximal distortions exist in association with linearly propagating maximal distortions. And so while the maximal distortion components of second level structures are repetitively and periodically interacting to produce what we perceive and conceive as matter that has mass and expresses time, the less than maximal distortion components of those same second level structures are summating with each other to produce an elliptically distributed less than maximal distortion field that we perceive and conceive as the gravitational fields that surround and exist in association with matter. And the reason the summated or combined radially propagating less than maximal distortion components end up elliptically surrounding the repetitively interacting maximal distortion components goes back to the fact that all reality cell content, whether distorted or uniform, is being exchanged at the speed of light as a function of the dynamic that is intrinsic to the first level of relational structure. And so distorted reality cell content always propagates from reality cell to reality cell at the speed of light, regardless of whether what is being propagated is a maximal distortion of content or a less than maximal distortion of content. And so when the maximal distortion components of two or more second level relational structures start spiraling around and orbiting each other as a third level relational structure, those maximal distortion components are then propagating nonlinearly at the speed of light. However, each of those maximal distortion components is still radiating around itself a less than maximal distortion that continues to propagate away from its point of origin at the speed of light. And so what happens is that the summated or combined less than maximal distortions end up propagating out ahead of the nonlinearly propagating maximal distortions, so that the repetitively interacting maximal distortion components end up being elliptically surrounded by an exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion field. And gravitational fields are not spherical or perfectly round, but are elliptical, which is a sphere stretched into an oval, because what gravitational fields actually are at the level of relational structure is the summation of all the radially propagating less than maximal distortion components of these second level structures that are repetitively and so periodically interacting as a third level relational structure. And the summation of all those radially propagating less than maximal distortion components ends up being elliptically distributed around the repetitively interacting maximal distortion components because, as this drawing shows, as the repetitively interacting maximal distortion components propagate through the first level of relational structure as a third level relational structure, those repetitively interacting maximal distortion components as a unit have a linear vector of speed that is always less than the speed of light. And yet, each repetitively interacting maximal distortion component is still radiating around itself a less than maximal distortion that radially propagates away from its point of origin at the speed of light. And so what happens is that the less than maximal distortion components pass up and get out ahead of the repetitively interacting maximal distortion components. But because the repetitively interacting maximal distortion components still have a linear vector of speed, that aspect of the third level structure ends up closer to the front end and sides of the outwardly radiating less than maximal distortion field than it does to the rear end of that same field, causing that field to have an elliptical rather than perfectly round shape. And so here I need to point out that, contrary to popular scientific belief, in the same way that time is not a fourth dimension of space, the force of gravity is not the result of matter somehow causing space to bend or curve. That's just another delusion that has arisen as a result of mistaking the physical appearances for being realities that are actually there, where progressively and relationally structured awareness actually is. Nothing bends space, nothing curves space. The structure and so shape of space is what it is because the structure of space is the first level of relational structure. And the first level of relational structure is not altered or changed as a result of higher order relational structures emerging within it. If higher order relational structures were somehow able to change the structure of the prior levels of reality from which they emerge as more highly iterated forms of those prior levels of structure, they would be changing the structural foundation of their own structural reality. And so, just by existing, they would be changing and so undercutting the structural basis of their own structural reality. And so, that just doesn't happen. But what does happen is that propagational patterns of distorted reality cell content come into existence as higher order relational structures within the first level of relational structure or within the structure of space. And one of those propagational patterns of distorted reality cell content is the elliptical distribution of an exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion field around repetitively interacting and so nonlinearly propagating maximal distortion components, thereby causing what appears as space to function as if it were somehow being curved by the presence of matter within it, when that elliptically distributed and exponentially diminishing less than maximal distortion field acts upon another third level structure that enters into that field, in which case it then functions as what we perceive and conceive as the attractive force of gravity, pulling the physical object toward the repetitively interacting maximal distortion components and simultaneously accelerating it. And now, all that context having been established, I will now explain the relationally structured basis that underlies why what we perceive and conceive as gravity operates as an attractive force. As already alluded to, there are two aspects to the way that gravity functions as an attractive force, and we will look at each of those aspects separately to see how they each derive from the less than maximal distortion field that is actually there where we perceive and conceive the physical force of gravity to be. One way that gravity functions as an attractive force is by altering the propagational direction of light and matter, and the other way that gravity functions as an attractive force is by accelerating matter. And so the force of gravity is able to do two things to matter, but is only able to do one thing to light. Gravity is able to change the propagational direction of both matter and light, but gravity is only able to accelerate matter and cannot accelerate light. And gravity can't accelerate light because light is already propagating from reality cell to reality cell with complete linearity at the speed of light. And the reality that's actually there just can't be made to move faster than it is already moving as it becomes and functions as the first two levels of relational awareness structure. And so gravity can do two things to matter: change its direction and accelerate it, and can only do one thing to light: change its direction. And as I will explain, both of those abilities have as their underlying basis the effect that an asymmetrically distributed less than maximal distortion field is able to have upon which adjacent reality cell a maximal distortion component propagates into next, as it continues to propagate from reality cell to reality cell either linearly or nonlinearly at the speed of light. As Einstein predicted and has since been verified, a strong enough gravitational field can bend or alter the otherwise completely linear path of light, but not because space has been somehow bent or curved, but simply because of the consistent effect an asymmetrically distributed less than maximal distortion field is able to have upon which adjacent reality cell a maximal distortion component propagates into next. And to review, the consistent effect an asymmetrically distributed less than maximal distortion field has with regard to determining which adjacent reality cell a maximal distortion component propagates into next is that it is able to cause a maximal distortion component to propagate into a reality cell that is not in linear progression, but which instead lies in the direction of more or greater less than maximal distortion. And so light, which is our physical perception of the maximal distortion component of a second level relational structure, can have its direction of propagation altered but cannot be accelerated. And so, as Einstein predicted, the path of light can be bent or altered by a large enough gravitational field. Basically, the same force that bends the path of light or attracts light is the same force that causes maximal distortion components to repetitively and so periodically spiral about and orbit each other. And again, that force is the consistent effect that an asymmetrically distributed less than maximal distortion field is able to have upon which adjacent reality cell a maximal distortion propagates into next. And to review, that effect exists because the two components that make up second level relational structures do not have an existence that is separate and apart from each other, but instead have an existence that is completely intertwined and interrelated, inasmuch as each component is continuously helping to reproduce the other component. And so I would like to point out here that in order to explain mass, time, and gravity, I am not really describing anything that's completely new, but am just describing new ways in which already described features of relationally structured reality interact with each other to produce what appears as a completely new feature at the level of physical reality, but which seemingly new feature is really just a more highly iterated version of some already existent feature that exists at the level of relational structure. And I keep pointing that out because I don't want you to lose sight of the fact of how simple reality actually is and just how little is actually going on at the level of what's actually there. It's just the same singular and fundamental reality moving at the same speed and as a result forming a progressive series of relations with itself that cause it to function as a progressive series of relational structures. And so, no matter what appears to be there, and no matter what words and concepts I use to describe in terms of relational structure, what's actually there, what's always and only ever actually there at every point in the universe is some relationally structured form of the speed of light movement of the fundamental reality. And how any particular level of relational structure functions is itself a function of how the characteristics and features that exist at all prior levels of relational structure are interacting to produce that new level of relational structure. And so any new level of relational structure that does arise is always, in the final analysis, just the same old fundamental reality moving at the same old speed, no matter how that level of relational structure appears when translated by our minds into a physical appearance. In any case, the same force that bends or attracts light is the same force that causes maximal distortion components to repetitively and so periodically spiral about and orbit each other as part of a third level relational structure. And so gravity and inertia are truly equivalent forces because what we perceive and conceive as both the force of gravity and the force of inertia is the same underlying reality, as that underlying reality is being applied to repetitively interacting maximal distortion components from two different directions, as illustrated in this drawing. Specifically, when a less than maximal distortion field acts upon repetitively interacting maximal distortion components from the inside out, it functions as an inertial field that stabilizes the periodic geometric structure that those maximal distortion components are producing. And because it is that periodic geometric structure that determines how relatively fast or slow those maximal distortion components propagate through the first level of relational structure as a third level relational structure, stabilizing that periodic geometric structure has the effect of causing that third level structure to resist changes to its speed, and which resistance to such changes we attribute to the force called inertia. On the other hand, when a less than maximal distortion field acts upon repetitively interacting maximal distortion components from the outside in, it functions as a gravitational field that destabilizes and changes their periodic geometric structure. And that changed periodic geometric structure then determines how much relatively faster or slower those repetitively interacting maximal distortion components as a unit propagate through the first level of relational structure as part of a third level relational structure, and which changes in speed we attribute to the force called gravity. And so Einstein's equivalence of gravitational and inertial mass ultimately derives from the fact that the relationally structured reality that underlies both of those forces is the exact same and so equivalent reality, and specifically is the less than maximal distortion field that exists in association with the repetitively interacting maximal distortion components that are actually there wherever matter, or any particle that has mass, appears to be. And so, as this drawing indicates, as that less than maximal distortion field exists and operates on repetitively interacting maximal distortion components from the inside out to stabilize their periodic geometric structure, it functions as the physical force that we perceive and conceive as inertia. And as that same less than maximal distortion field operates on repetitively interacting maximal distortion components from the outside in to destabilize their periodic geometric structure, it functions as the physical force that we perceive and conceive as gravity. And now let's focus on just the gravitational force to see how it accelerates and decelerates matter. As already mentioned, gravity can change the direction of propagation of light but cannot accelerate light, whereas gravity can both change the direction of propagation of matter while simultaneously accelerating it or decelerating it. And the reason gravity can accelerate or decelerate matter is because an externally applied less than maximal distortion field has the ability to alter the propagational linearity of the repetitively and so periodically interacting maximal distortion components that are actually there where matter, as a physical reality, only appears to be. Specifically, as this drawing shows from top to bottom, gravity accelerates matter by increasing the propagational linearity of its maximal distortion components. And as the same drawing shows from bottom to top, gravity decelerates matter by decreasing the propagational linearity of its maximal distortion components. And the way gravity increases the propagational linearity of the maximal distortion components of a third level structure is by causing additional maximal distortion quanta to be inserted into the propagational path of each individual maximal distortion component of which a given third level structure is composed. And those additional maximal distortion quanta are simultaneously inserted into the propagational path of each individual maximal distortion component as a function of the same mechanism that causes the path of light to bend or causes maximal distortions to repetitively spiral or orbit each other. And that same mechanism is the mechanism by which an asymmetrically distributed, less than maximal distortion field is able to influence which adjacent reality cell a maximal distortion component propagates into next. And so when matter or a third level structure enters a strong enough gravitational field, that asymmetrically distributed less than maximal distortion field simultaneously changes the propagational path of all of the repetitively interacting maximal distortion components in a way that simultaneously increases their propagational linearity, thereby accelerating the matter in the direction of the source of that gravitational field. And that acceleration in the direction of the source of the gravitational field brings the third level structure deeper into that same gravitational field, where an even stronger asymmetrically distributed less than maximal distortion field then acts again on its maximal distortion components to, once again, simultaneously increase their propagational linearity, and so once again accelerate the matter. And so what we perceive as the gravitational acceleration of matter is really, at the level of relational structure, the result of the repeated insertion of maximal distortion quanta into a third level relational structure, thereby incrementally increasing the propagational linearity of the repetitively and so periodically interacting maximal distortion components of which the third level structure is composed, and thereby incrementally increasing the speed at which that third level structure propagates through the first level of relational structure. And that's why in a vacuum, a feather and a rock are accelerated at the same rate by a given gravitational field. And that's because an externally applied less than maximal distortion field is not acting upon the third level structure as a whole, but is exerting its effect at the level of the individual maximal distortion components that make up those two different bits of matter, increasing the propagational linearity of each component to the exact same degree, and so accelerating each bit of matter the exact same amount. As far as a gravitational or less than maximal distortion field is concerned, it does not matter if some bit of matter is composed of 2 or 2 trillion repetitively interacting maximal distortion components, because it can cause the simultaneous insertion of 2 trillion maximal distortion quanta into a third level structural period just as easily as it can cause the simultaneous insertion of 2 maximal distortion quanta into a third level structural period. And that's because gravity works by changing the inertial field of the object so that the repetitively interacting maximal distortion components now propagate with increased linearity, resulting in additional maximal distortion quanta being inserted into the third level structural period. And gravity is able to alter the inertial field of an object because, as explained earlier, gravity and inertia are not actually two different things but are just two different modes of operation of the same relational structure. And so a material object cannot enter a gravitational field without having its inertial field altered. Put another way, a third level structure cannot enter an externally arising less than maximal distortion field without having its internal less than maximal distortion field altered, because those two fields are going to summate, thereby changing its internal less than maximal distortion field. And that change in its internal less than maximal distortion field, or its inertial field, then causes its maximal distortion components to propagate with increased linearity, resulting in additional maximal distortion quanta being inserted into that third level relational structure, with the end result being a third level structure that is propagating through the first level relational structure with a greater degree of propagational linearity, and so at a faster speed with greater mass, and so with greater energy, while expressing less time. And the deceleration of matter by gravity is just the same process in reverse. That is, as this drawing shows from bottom to top, as matter moves farther away from the source of a gravitational field, its inertial field is altered in a way that results in maximal distortion quanta being removed from it in a way that incrementally decreases its propagational linearity, thereby incrementally slowing the matter down or decelerating it, with the end result being a third level structure that is propagating through the first level of relational structure with a lesser degree of propagational linearity, and so at a slower speed with less mass, and so with less energy, while expressing more time. And that brings to a close my description of third level relational structures and how those structures exist and function as the underlying basis of the physical reality that we perceive and conceive as matter, and which physical reality we perceive and conceive to either possess or exist in association with the physical characteristics that we refer to as mass, time, gravity, and inertia. And what I've just done is not just show you what those physical characteristics are all actually derived from at the level of relational structure. What I've also done is show you how those characteristics are all related to each other as a function of the multi-leveled relational structure that is actually there where physical reality only appears to be, and which multi-leveled relational structure I have done my best to demonstrate is composed of a singular and formless reality moving in relation to itself at the speed of light, and absolutely nothing more. You see, unlike mainstream science, which has been trying to figure out the nature of reality while treating mind-generated experiential appearances that are no more real than reflections in rainbows as if they were realities that are actually there, I decided to try to figure out what the nature of reality might look like if one treated physical reality as a created appearance rather than as the reality that's actually there. And as a result, in order to explain things, unlike mainstream science, I don't have to keep inventing new things to toss into the mix in order to make my model of reality work. Instead, all I have to do is explain how the prior level of relationally structured reality functions as the next level of relationally structured reality once that prior level of reality forms a stable relation with itself. What science has right now are physical facts and an understanding that some of those facts are related in consistent and so predictable ways. And that has allowed science to become very good at manipulating certain aspects of relationally structured reality, and so has created the illusion that science, to a large extent, understands the nature of reality. But what I'm saying and what I'm demonstrating by showing where physical facts actually come from and how they are all related is that right now science does not know jack shit about the nature of reality, because almost all scientists, like almost all human beings, are operating from within a conceptual context that was constructed using and so is being held together by the mistaken belief that a reality that is only a mind generated appearance is, in some way, shape, or form, the reality that's actually there. And while operating from within that erroneously constructed conceptual context, it is simply not possible to connect the physical facts in a way that is accurately reflective of the nature of reality. Because from within that erroneously constructed conceptual context, the only way to connect the physical facts or dots to each other is in a way that always leaves you with a conception of reality where physical reality is still seen as being the reality that's actually there, and so is still seen as being the primary reality, in which case then all other realities, including consciousness or awareness, must continue to be seen as secondary realities, regardless of the actual hierarchy of reality, which is to say, regardless of which of those realities is really primary and which reality is really secondary. You think you see reality the way you see it because that's the way it actually is. But the fact is, you see reality as you see it primarily as a function of whatever mind generated conceptual reality you're operating from within, because that conceptual reality functions as a filter that limits what you can become aware of as reality and also colors whatever you do become aware of as reality. And whatever mind generated conceptual reality you are operating from within also dictates and so limits the nature of any additional conceptual realities that you can construct while operating from within it, as you become aware of the physical world around you and then attempt to understand that physical world through mental interpretation or conceptualization. And as a result, science, as it presently stands, really doesn't explain much of anything about the nature of reality, at least in an accurate way, which is to say, in a way that is accurately reflective of the actual hierarchy and nature of reality. What science can explain is that if you do this, then that will happen, or that if you do that, then this will happen. That's pretty much it. And the rest is just mind generated conceptual bullshit that has nothing to do with the actual nature of reality, but has only to do with scientists using physical facts to construct conceptions of reality that can't possibly be accurately reflective of the actual nature of reality, because those conceptions of reality have all been constructed from within a conception of reality that is itself completely inaccurate. Now, science has various conceptual and mathematical models that attempt to explain why this happens when you do that or why that happens when you do this, but none of those models are complete and they all contradict each other in some way. And they are all incomplete and all contradict each other in some way because they are all based upon and derived from the false assumption that physical facts are in some way objectively representative of the reality that's actually there, and it is simply not possible to construct an accurate and internally consistent conceptual model of reality when your foundational assumption regarding the nature of the reality that you are using to construct that model, i.e., physical reality, is itself completely inaccurate. On the other hand, what I have done is construct a conceptual model of reality that is both internally consistent as well as consistent with many of the most fundamental physical facts that presently exist, and in addition, also explains why those fundamental facts exist and how they are all related. And I was able to do that because I did what Rene Descartes recommended, and in my early 20s set aside all my previous beliefs and started over again. Here's how he put it. Some years ago, I was struck by how many false things I had believed, and by how doubtful was the structure of beliefs that I had based on them. I realized that if I wanted to establish anything in the sciences that was stable and likely to last, I needed, just once in my life, to demolish everything completely and start again from the foundations. And what I realized was that the foundational belief upon which all my other beliefs about reality rested was the belief that physical reality is the reality that's actually there. And so I set that belief aside and started over, because that belief had been brought into doubt by the phenomenon of wave particle duality, and also by the fact that our brains must be, in some way responsible for creating what we experience as physical reality. And setting that belief aside made it possible for me to realize that if physical reality is not the reality that's actually there, then it must be a mind or brain generated appearance that exists as a sort of etching of the reality that is actually there. Because clearly, physical reality is not completely unrelated to whatever reality is actually there, otherwise, it would serve no purpose. And so I went off in search of the reality that is actually there and eventually came to the conclusion that formless awareness or consciousness was most likely more fundamental than physical, mental, or emotional reality, since none of those experiential realities have any demonstrable existence whatsoever outside the context of some awareness or consciousness of them. Because although Descartes was correct about the need to question one's most deeply held and fundamental beliefs, he was not correct about "I think, therefore I am." Descartes' "I think, therefore I am" is a statement that actually encapsulates what Eckhart Tolle has explained as the human condition, which is the dysfunctional condition of awareness or consciousness having completely identified with mind-generated conceptual forms, and as a result, becoming effectively trapped and confined within the mind that is producing those forms, where it then suffers while remaining completely unaware or unconscious of the reality that is both actually there and what it really is. In the statement, "I think, therefore I am," Descartes mistakenly equates the process and product of thinking with his essential nature of beingness. However, far more accurate and closer to the truth than the statement, "I think, therefore I am," is the statement, "I am aware or conscious of thinking, therefore I am." And that's because that statement equates that which is aware or conscious of the process of thinking and thought with one's essential nature or beingness, and so equates two things that actually are the same thing, rather than equating two things that are not the same thing at all. And Descartes came to his mistaken conclusion because he, like almost all other human beings, had been rendered completely unaware of the reality of awareness as a function of believing physical reality to be the reality that's actually there, thereby leaving him with no choice other than to identify with the only realities he was left aware of once his actual and essential nature or beingness had been completely obscured from his awareness, which is to say, once his actual and essential nature or beingness had been completely obscured from itself. And people loved the phrase, "I think, therefore I am," and still do, because it validates their mistaken view of themselves as being what is actually only a mind-generated conceptual reality or thought form. And that identification, which is really a misidentification, is expressed by the statements, "I am this" or "I am that," where the words "this" and "that" can be any concept the mind can construct. And so Descartes' "I think, therefore I am" is very instructive. It's just not instructive of what we really are, but is only instructive of what it is that we are left to mistakenly believe ourselves to be once our awareness manages to obscure its own reality from itself. In any case, once I came to the conclusion that formless awareness or consciousness was likely more fundamental than physical reality, I next went about trying to figure out how a completely formless reality could end up appearing as all this seemingly solid physical stuff. And I eventually realized the only way a single reality could evolve and differentiate was through self-relation, since it would have nothing else to work with other than itself. And now here I am, a mere 40 years later, explaining the process by which a formless reality forms a series of iterative and so progressive relations with itself, and in so doing, functions as the progressive series of relational structures that are actually there, where all the mind-generated physical etchings only appear to be. And how does a formless reality form a relation with itself? Through movement in relation to itself. And so there is only one fundamental reality, but that fundamental reality has two inseparable aspects, one of which is formless content and the other of which is the speed of light movement of that formless content. And what I've just done in the last two videos is describe step by step how that formless and fundamental reality, while moving in relation to itself at the speed of light, structurally evolves into the three different progressive and related levels of relational structure that are actually there, where we perceive the three different progressive and related physical realities of space, light, and matter to be. And so, even though I talk a lot about structure, please keep in mind that what I describe as any relational structure is not really a structure, but is just a pattern movement of the formless and fundamental reality. Movement is primary and fundamental, whereas structure is always a secondary effect of that primary reality. And movement is primary and fundamental because movement is an inseparable aspect of the fundamental reality. On the other hand, structure is not an aspect of the fundamental reality. Instead, what you perceive as physical structure is just an etching that your mind is able to produce when the reality in motion that is actually there, where your physical body appears to be, forms a transient structural relation with the same reality in motion that is all around you. And that transient structural relation, which I refer to as an impactive relation, allows your mind to produce the projected appearance that you become aware of as a physical experience or reality. And the formless awareness that's both actually there and what you really are is only able to form that transient structural relation with itself and so produce what it then becomes aware of as physical reality once it has structurally evolved into a third level of relational structure. And because physical reality is created as the product of a structural relation, it appears primarily in terms of form or structure. But form or structure is not what's actually there where any physical reality appears to be. And that's because what's actually there, as I have just explained and described in some detail, is a formless reality in motion, and specifically is the formless reality of awareness in motion at the speed of light, and even more specifically, is the formless reality that is aware of these words. But all we are left to be aware of or conscious of once we mistake those created physical forms for being realities that are actually there, and so obscure from our awareness the formless reality that is actually there, are mind generated physical and mental experiential forms, and also emotional reality, which is also a created and apparent reality. And as a result, we misidentify with those experiential forms and also mistakenly see form or structure as being primary, and so mistakenly see movement as being a secondary reality that can be applied to what we believe to be the primary reality of form or structure. Put another way, beyond the physical surface appearance, structure is not there and then put into motion. Instead, beyond the physical surface appearance, motion is there and it becomes organized into relational structures. But we see the relation between structure and movement in an upside down and topsy-turvy way, seeing structure as primary and movement as secondary, because we see all of reality in an upside down and topsy-turvy way, as a function of believing that what are only mind-generated appearances are realities that are actually there, thereby obscuring from our awareness the reality that is actually there, and thereby leaving us with nothing to know as real or to know as reality other than a bunch of mind-generated physical and mental forms and appearances that, relative to the formless reality that's both actually there and what we really are no more real than reflections and rainbows. Reflections and rainbows exist. Reflections and rainbows are realities that we can be aware of. And because we can be aware of reflections and rainbows, we can also be mistakenly aware of them as being realities that are actually there, where, as created appearances, they actually only appear to be. And because reflections and rainbows exist, we know that we can mistake what is only an appearance or apparent reality for being a reality that is actually there. And as a result, we also know that mistaking what is only an appearance or apparent reality for being the reality that's actually there has the effect of obscuring from our awareness the reality that is actually there, where we mistakenly believe the purely apparent reality to be. And the appearance or purely apparent reality is there in some way, otherwise we could not and would not be aware of it. But here's the key thing. When we believe what is only an appearance or apparent reality to be the reality that's actually there, that appearance or apparent reality is not actually there in the way that we believe it to be there. Any appearance or apparent reality is only ever actually there as a surface phenomenon that, like a projection or reflection, is being superimposed upon whatever reality is actually there. But when we mistakenly believe what is actually only an appearance or apparent reality to be the reality that's actually there, we become, in that moment, and for as long as we cling to that mistaken belief, completely incapable of becoming aware of the reality that is actually there. Now, why is that? Why does mistakenly believing an appearance or apparent reality to be the reality that's actually there obscure from our awareness the reality that is actually there? And the answer to that question is as follows. When an individual awareness becomes mistakenly aware of what is only an apparent reality as being the reality that's actually there, the reality upon which that apparent reality is being superimposed, which is the reality that is actually there, becomes hidden behind that apparent reality, simply because awareness never tries to look past or beyond that now delusional apparent reality, because it mistakenly believes there is no reality there for it to become aware of, because it mistakenly believes that it is already aware of the reality that's actually there. That's all. And that's why, for as long as you mistakenly believe a reflection to be what's actually there, you remain unaware of the mirror that is actually there, and which mirror you still have to be looking right at. Otherwise, you would not be aware of the reflection. And you don't become aware of the mirror simply because you never bother to project or direct your awareness beyond the now delusional reflection. Because why would you, since you mistakenly believe there is no reality there beyond that reflection for you to become aware of, since you mistakenly believe you are already aware of the reality that's actually there? And that's also why, for as long as you mistakenly believe what are only mind generated physical and mental appearances to be realities that are actually there, you will have either no awareness of or a very limited and distorted awareness of the ultimately formless reality that is both actually there and what you really are. And that's because, as a result of your mistaken belief in the physical and mental appearances as being realities that are actually there, you never bother to project or direct your awareness beyond those now delusional experiential appearances. Because why would you, since you mistakenly believe there is no reality there beyond those now delusional physical and mental appearances for you to become aware of? And as a result, you remain completely unaware of the formless awareness that is both actually there and what you really are, causing the now delusional physical and mental appearances to function as the walls of a cage in which your awareness has inadvertently and effectively trapped itself as a result of doing nothing more than making the mistake of believing that what are only mind generated experiential appearances are realities that are actually there. Now, here you may say, but I am aware of the reality of awareness or consciousness, and I still believe that physical reality is the reality that's actually there. So, how do you explain that, Mr. I think I'm so clever, know it all motherfucker? And here's how I explain that. What you are aware of is not the formless reality that's actually there, because what you are aware of are just words that have been invented to point toward that formless and fundamental reality. And so, what you are aware of are just mind generated conceptual forms that you mistakenly believe to be the inconceivable reality that those words, as concepts, can only ever point toward. The word sweet and the direct experience or awareness of sweetness are not the same thing. Anyone can understand that. And in the same way, the words awareness and consciousness and the formless reality those words point toward are not the same thing. But because we so firmly and fully believe that physical and mental reality are realities that are actually there, we mistakenly believe that when we are able to superimpose a word upon a thing, that we then know what that thing really is. When all that we really know is a mind generated conceptual form that was invented so we could have a way of pointing toward and indicating a particular reality. And right now, in the year 2024, it is simply the case that almost all human beings continue to believe that what are only mind generated physical and mental appearances are realities that are actually there. And as a result, almost all human beings remain completely unaware of the formless reality of awareness or consciousness that remains the reality that is actually there, even when it functions through self relation as a relational structure. But people have become increasingly aware of the words consciousness and awareness. But the awareness of those words is not the awareness of the thing itself. But because people have become increasingly aware of the words consciousness and awareness, while still mistakenly believing physical reality to be the reality that's actually there, they have had to find a way to fit those words into their conception of reality. And that's why I said, for as long as you mistake the physical and mental realities for being realities that are actually there, you will have either no awareness of or a very limited and distorted awareness of the ultimately formless reality that is both actually there and what you really are. And right now we have both, because we have a collective humanity that, by and large, has no awareness whatsoever of the reality that is both actually there and what they really are. And we also have a scientific establishment that mistakenly believes that the reality of consciousness or awareness, which they know only through words, is somehow the random product of the random machinations of the physical reality they mistakenly believe to be the reality that's actually there. And so don't delude yourself into believing that you know what the reality of awareness or consciousness is just because you know a couple of words and have placed those words into your conception of reality. Because even if you accurately place those words into your conception of reality by conceiving of the reality they point toward as being more fundamental than physical reality, as I have done and as many others have also done, as words they are still just mind creations and so are not the thing itself. The point I'm trying to make here is that the ultimate reason for explaining all of this stuff about reality is not to make you conceptually aware of the nature of reality. That is just a means to an end. The ultimate goal is to make it easier for you to become directly aware of the reality that you really are, so that you don't have to live your organic life trapped in an extremely limiting and painful mind-generated physical and mental reality, completely unaware of the formless and timeless awareness that is both actually there and what you really are. As I said in the last video, my function, as I see it, is to provide you with the opportunity to relocate from the desert to the beach so you can more easily enter into the ocean of infinite beingness that you really are and have never truly been separated from, although you can clearly become unaware of that ocean, which then creates the illusion that you have been in some way separated from what is your own reality. And as I also said in the last video, you do not have to understand the nature of reality in order to become directly aware of the reality that you really are, although it certainly doesn't hurt as long as you don't get caught up in that understanding by believing it to be some sort of absolute truth. Because if you do that, then you just end up stuck on the beach rather than stuck out in the desert. And although it may be somewhat more pleasant to be trapped on a beach rather than trapped in the middle of a desert, it's still quite painful compared to what it's like to swim in the ocean of infinite beingness that is your true, essential, and actual nature. And so, as I did in the two previous videos, I will begin to bring this third video to a close by referring you to Eckhart Tolle, whose every video is an invitation to go swimming in the beginningless, formless, and endless reality that you really are. And so once again, I will post a link to a couple of his videos. As Tolle says, we are like fish swimming in an ocean that have no awareness whatsoever of the water that is all around them. But it doesn't have to be that way, although it does tend to remain that way for as long as you continue to mistakenly believe that what are only mind-generated physical and mental appearances are realities that are actually there, where the reality that you really are actually is. And that's because that mistaken belief causes those mind-generated experiential appearances to function as reality-obscuring delusions that, once they have been converted into delusions by mistaken belief, then have the ability to hide from your awareness the non-physical, non-mental reality that is actually there, where mind-generated physical and mental reality only appear to be. What I'm trying to do is give you a choice with regard to what you believe about the nature of reality that is quite a bit different than the religious and scientific fairy tales that almost all human beings are taught to believe. Because you're bound to believe something about the nature of reality, and belief is a powerful thing. Because when you believe something that is completely inaccurate or not true, it fucks you up in a very real way by causing your awareness to become unable to become aware of the truth, and so causes your awareness to remain unaware of the truth even when it is staring you right in the face or standing right in front of you. And in the case of your mistaken belief regarding the nature of physical and mental reality, the truth that that mistaken belief is causing your awareness to remain unaware of is the truth of your own reality, which is both all around you as well as within you. because in the final analysis, there is nothing else that really and truly is other than the formless reality that both you and everything that you consider to be not you really are. Because everything else is just an experiential appearance that is being both created and known by that formless reality. And the unawareness of your own reality does not actually change or limit what you ultimately are, because nothing can do that. But that unawareness does, without question, change and limit what it is that the awareness that you really are is able to become aware of as both itself and the universe. However, while it is true that an inaccurate belief can fuck you up, it is also true that an accurate belief can unfuck you by overriding and replacing that inaccurate belief, and so removing from your mind a belief that was previously functioning to continuously convert some mind generated appearance into a reality obscuring delusion. And here I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that either religion or science are bad things. All I'm saying is that we need to let go of the fairy tales that both religion and science have come up with as their different ways of explaining the nature of reality, so that we can replace those fairy tales with a more unified, more accurate, and more functional interpretation of the nature of reality that does not continuously obscure from our individual awarenesses the reality that is both actually there and what we really are. Religion and science are both valid methods of inquiry into the nature of reality. One is based on spiritual insights or realizations, meaning some piercing of the experiential veil, and the other is based on physical facts. And those are both valid realities that can be used to construct a mental interpretation or conception of reality. But the problem is, humanity keeps trying to process and mentally interpret those spiritual insights and physical facts while operating from within a conception of reality that cannot do other than turn out completely inaccurate conceptions of reality that leave us believing that we have delved deeper into the nature of reality, when all we have really done is create another reality obscuring delusion that traps us even deeper and more thoroughly in our mind generated experiential environments, where we then suffer. And so I'm not shitting on either religion or science, as I have great respect for both and for the true practitioners of both. But what I am shitting on, and will continue to shit on, are the interpretations of reality that both religion and science have come up with based on the mistaken belief that physical reality is the reality that's actually there, because it's just not. And any interpretation or conception of reality that uses that false assumption as its basis cannot possibly be in any way accurately reflective of the actual nature of reality. As I said in the last video, if there was a contest right now between religion and science to see which interpretation of reality is more accurate, meaning which is the least inaccurate, religion would win, because religion at least acknowledges or points toward a more fundamental reality and intelligence that exists beyond physical reality, even though it tends to distort and mutate that fundamental reality and intelligence, and in some cases goes completely off the rails by portraying that fundamental reality and intelligence as some sort of jealous and vengeful psychopath that is so insecure that it demands that its creations believe in it, or else it will torture them for all of eternity. And even if those creations do believe in it, if they step too far out of line, that too is grounds for eternal torture and torment, even though it loves them unconditionally, or so we are told. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, that sounds more like an abusive and controlling partner than it does an all pervasive, all knowing, and all loving God or intelligence. On the other hand, as far as science is concerned, it's all just probabilistic and deterministic physical stuff randomly interacting to somehow produce both all that we see around us as well as the reality of consciousness or awareness by which all the physical stuff is known, and the absence of which reality none of the physical stuff could even be known. No wonder so many people end up taking anti-anxiety agents and antidepressants after having been born into a world where they are taught by religion that they could spend all of eternity being tortured by a God that loves them unconditionally, and are taught by science that there is no God and that the universe, and so their life, is a completely random creation, and so is ultimately completely pointless and meaningless. Put another way, if you truly and deeply believe the religious stories about heaven and hell, there is no way you could do anything other than live in a state of almost continuous fear, which many people do. And if you truly and deeply believe the scientific stories regarding the ultimately random nature of reality, there is no way you could do anything other than live in a state of almost continuous depression, which many people do. And all of that suffering takes place even though the formless awareness you really are is in no way different or separable from the formless awareness out of which the entire universe is actually constructed and of which it is actually composed, beyond its physical surface appearance. But you don't know what you really are because you were born into a human society that has become divided into two conceptual camps, a religious camp and a scientific camp. And both of those camps tell stories about the nature of yourself and reality that are complete and utter fairy tales. It's a classic Hobson's choice because whichever camp you choose to go with, you're still completely screwed, at least in terms of what you become aware of as the nature of reality. You see, we tend to assume that either religion or science must be correct with regard to their different and seemingly opposite interpretations of the nature of reality, and so we think we have to choose one or the other. But have you ever considered the possibility that they are both incorrect and that the nature of reality is completely different than the way it is portrayed in the stories told by both religion and science? I did, and that made it possible for me to look at the nature of reality in a completely different way, which then made it possible for me to come up with a story about the nature of reality that I believe the physical evidence shows is far more accurate than the stories about the nature of reality being presently told by either religion or science. However, my story also explains why religion and science are both valid methods of inquiry into the nature of reality. And so I did not abandon the methods of either religion or science. I just took the essential elements of each, which are the consistent spiritual insights of religion and the consistent physical facts of science, and then assembled those two different sorts of facts in a conceptual context where each set of facts, rather than being forced to deny the validity of the other, could instead work with the other to produce a story that explains reality as a whole, thereby demonstrating the validity of both perspectives. And I was able to do that because I stopped believing in physical reality as being the reality that's actually there, and so was able to recognize that there must be a more fundamental non physical reality actually there where physical reality only appears to be. And religion tries to explain reality in terms of that more fundamental non physical reality, whereas science tries to explain reality in terms of physical reality. That's all. No conflict, just two different realities, one of which is actually there and the other of which is a created appearance that is being superimposed upon the reality that is actually there. And so I do not deny the validity of either religion or science as a method of inquiry into the nature of reality. But what I do deny is the validity of most of the stories that each tells about the nature of reality, because those stories were all constructed in a conceptual context where it is simply not possible to accurately interpret the sort of facts that each deals with. However, neither the religionists nor the scientists, at least the sincere ones, have tried to deceive you. They have just done the best they could to interpret the realities they are dealing with while operating in a conceptual context that makes it completely impossible to accurately interpret those realities. That's all. They were taught that this is the way it is, and they believed it. And so they then went on and taught that. And then the person they taught believed what they were taught, and so then went on to teach the next generation the same thing, or some slightly modified version of the same thing, and on it goes, with each prior generation filling the minds of subsequent generations with mistaken beliefs and stories about the nature of reality that unknowingly and inadvertently function to keep the human awarenesses that believe those stories completely trapped in mind generated experiential cages that we ourselves as individual awarenesses then maintain by continuing to cling to the absolute bullshit that we were taught to believe about the nature of reality by very well meaning people. It's just one mind being filled with conceptual crap and not recognizing it as crap, but instead seeing that crap as truth and then trying to do the right thing by transferring to the minds of subsequent generations what to them seems to be truth, but is actually crap. That's all. And that situation will never change until we change what we believe about the nature of physical reality, so that we can begin to interpret both spiritual insights and physical facts in a conceptual context where there is at least a chance that we can accurately interpret those two different types of realities, so that we can produce conceptions of reality that, instead of functioning to obscure from our awareness the formless reality that is both actually there and what we really are, will instead direct our attention beyond those conceptions and so toward and into that formless reality. Now, there may be some out there who think I'm being overly harsh by referring to science's present day materialistic and probabilistic conception of reality as a fairy tale that is complete and utter bullshit. But how else should I refer to a story that is the complete opposite of the actual situation? Rabbits exist and Easter eggs exist, and very young children are told a story that makes a connection between those two realities that does not actually exist in any way, shape, or form. That is a fairy tale. And physical facts exist, and consciousness or awareness exist. And people all over the world are told a story by science that makes a connection between those two realities that does not actually exist in any way, shape, or form. And so that too is a fairy tale. And just because it's a fairy tale that is taught in institutions of higher learning all over the world does not make it any less of a fairy tale. All that does is make it a fairy tale that large numbers of people mistakenly believe must be true. And science has come up with its story about a materialistic, probabilistic, and completely random universe where consciousness or awareness in some mysterious and unknown way just sort of pops up by accident by making connections between physical facts in the context of a mistaken belief regarding the nature of those facts. And that story could not be more inaccurate if they tried. The story that mainstream science presently tells is that the physical universe in which we find ourselves has emerged and evolved through a process that is analogous to a monkey endlessly and randomly banging away at a typewriter and eventually producing a series of letters that appear to have meaning even though there actually is none, and that what we refer to as consciousness or awareness is just one of those random products. And that story could not be more inaccurate, because what we are aware of as the physical universe has actually emerged as the result of an underlying awareness and intelligence structurally evolving through iterative and progressive movement in relation to itself. And the reality that you really are is that underlying awareness and intelligence. But you are that underlying awareness and intelligence as it is flowing through and animating a relationally structured form of itself. And the relationally structured form of yourself that you are flowing through and animating has evolved a structure that we refer to as a mind, and that mind is able to produce the two different and yet related types of experiential appearances that we refer to as physical and mental reality. And because the underlying awareness and intelligence that you really are has naturally and unavoidably mistaken those mind generated experiential appearances for being realities that are actually there, you have inadvertently converted those experiential appearances into delusions that then, as delusions, have the ability to obscure from your awareness the underlying awareness and intelligence that is actually there where the physical universe appears to be. And that obscuring of the reality that is both actually there and what you really are from your awareness has left your awareness, as it flows through and animates your body and mind, effectively trapped in a mind generated physical and mental experiential environment that you mistakenly believe to be what is real and all is real, and also what you really are. And you suffer tremendously as a result. And physical and mental reality are real. Otherwise, we would not be aware of them. They are just not real in the way that we believe them to be real, because neither of them is a reality that is actually there, because both of them are just mind generated appearances, one of which is being created by external projection, and the other which is being created by internal reflection. And I'll eventually go into the details of how we use our minds to create those two experiential appearances. But before I can do that in a meaningful way, I first need to establish additional context. And the additional context that needs to be established is the explanation and description of the new relation that formless awareness is able to form with itself once it is functioning as a third level of relational structure. and which new relation then causes it to function as the fourth level relational awareness structures that are actually there where we perceive any living or animated matter to be. And so by the end of the next video, you should have a fairly clear understanding of what you really are and the situation that the reality that you really are has placed itself in. Because in the next video, I'll basically be explaining how the formless awareness that we really are makes it possible for this to happen. And once you understand that, you will then be in a position to understand why it became necessary for formless awareness to structurally evolve into and so create these specialized fourth level structures that we refer to as our brains or minds, and which specialized structures our individual awarenesses use to produce the purely apparent realities that we are aware of as physical and mental reality, but which purely apparent realities we naturally and unavoidably mistake for being realities that are actually there, thereby obscuring from our individual awarenesses our own reality, and thereby leaving our individual awarenesses effectively trapped in mind-generated realities that, as created appearances, are no more real than reflections or rainbows, and so, relative to the reality that we really are no more real than a dream. And on that note, I will say goodbye for now, and until the next time, namaste.
I'm a dreamer, aren't we all? Just a dreamer, but aren't we all? In my dreams each night, it seems my lover comes to call. He's so charming, strong and tall. It's alarming how I fall. He's ideal, but then he isn't real.